Elara did not cry when the ceremony ended. She stood in the middle of the stone circle, while every other person around her took a slow step back, as if she carried something contagious. The night air was cold. The torch fires on either side of the platform snapped and hissed in the wind. Her feet were bare on the ancient rock, the way they were supposed to be during the awakening, so the earth could feel you, and call to the wolf inside. The earth had felt her tonight. It had called, and nothing had answered. Elder Dorn held the ceremonial bowl in both hands, and stared at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. He had overseen 42 awakenings in his life. He had seen wolves rise slowly, wolves rise with tears, wolves rise with such power that the fire in the torches had gone sideways from the force of it. He had never seen nothing. Not once. Not in 42 years. He set the bowl down without a word. Elara looked at her hands. Her palms were open, the way the ritual required. She had held them out for the entire ceremony, waiting for the warmth she had heard about her whole life, the pull deep in the chest, the golden glow beneath the skin that every member of the Ashvale pack described when they told their awakening stories. Her cousin Nora had said it felt like swallowing sunlight. Her father had said, it was like remembering something you had forgotten your whole life. Elara felt none of it. She felt the cold. She felt the stone beneath her feet. She felt the eyes of every pack member watching from the ring of firelight, and she felt the moment those eyes stopped being curious and became something else. Something harder, something that had already decided. She lowered her hands. Elder Dorn finally spoke. His voice was steady, practiced, the kind of voice that had delivered hard news many times and had learned not to dress it up. He said she was not awakened. He said it was possible, in rare cases, that a wolf could be hollow, a body born into a wolf family but carrying no wolf inside. It had happened before, long ago. It was not shameful, he said, though every person in that circle knew the word was hollow in more ways than one. Elara kept her face still. Her father, Garrett Voss, stood 6 rows back. He was a wide-shouldered man who had always been proud of his rank, proud of the family name, proud of his daughter's dark eyes and sharp mind. She had watched him fight in 3 territorial matches. She had watched him come home bleeding and call it a good day. He was not a gentle man, but he had never been cruel to her. He had taught her how to read trail signs, how to remember the pack's old songs, how to hold a fishing line with patience. He was the person she had always looked to when something went wrong. She looked at him now. He was looking somewhere slightly to the left of her face. She understood everything in that moment, not because of the elder's words, and not because of the cold, and not because of the silence that had swallowed the ceremony grounds. She understood it because of where her father's eyes were pointing. He was not angry. He was not ashamed. He was doing the only thing a man like Garrett Voss could do when the world handed him something he did not know how to carry. He was setting it down. He was setting her down. The walk back through the pack village was the longest she had ever taken. The ceremony grounds sat on the eastern ridge, and the village spread down the slope below it, in a sprawl of stone houses with low roofs and lit windows. It was the kind of place that looked warm from a distance. She had always loved looking at it from above when she came back from the forest, the way the amber light came through every window and made the whole settlement look like scattered embers. She had always felt, coming down that slope, that she was coming home to something. Tonight the village looked the same. The lights were the same, the path was the same, but she felt the distance between herself and those lit windows in a way she never had before, as if a wall of glass had quietly been placed between her and every good thing she had assumed was hers. Her friend Petra was waiting at the bottom of the ridge path. Petra was 17 and had not yet had her own awakening, which meant she was still technically in the same rank as Elara, which meant she had nothing to lose by being here. Her face was pulled in an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral, and not quite managing it. She said the right things. She said it didn't mean anything, that some wolves woke up late, that she had heard of people whose gifts came in after the ceremony. She said Elara was one of the smartest people she knew, and that had to count for something. Elara thanked her. She kept her voice even. She meant the thanks. She also knew that Petra would not be at her door tomorrow morning the way she usually was. She knew it the way you sometimes know things without being told. There was a line that had been drawn tonight, and Petra was young and sensible, and she would eventually stand on the right side of it. Elara did not blame her. She simply noted it and stored it away in the part of herself that kept track of true things. The next morning, Elder Dorn came to their house before the sun was fully up. He spoke to her father in the main room. Elara sat in the kitchen on the other side of the wall and listened through the plaster. She was good at listening. She had always had sharper ears than most. The elder was calm. He was always calm. He explained the arrangements. Without a wolf, Elara could not hold the rank her family name had given her. She would be reassigned to the service quarter on the south side of the village. She would work in the pack's laundry hall and assist with food preparation during gatherings. She would be housed with the other service-ranked members. She would be given fair meals and fair treatment, and no one would harm her. She was not being punished, Elder Dorn said carefully. She was simply being placed where the pack's needs could be met, and where her own abilities could be used in a practical way. Her father said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, that he understood. He did not argue. He did not say his daughter deserved better. He did not push back on a single word. Elara sat very still in the kitchen and looked at the grain of the wooden table. She traced one long mark in the wood with her fingertip, back and forth, very slowly. She moved to the service quarter that afternoon. The room she was given was small but not unkind. It had a window that faced the northern forest. The bed had a firm mattress and 2 blankets. There was a hook on the wall for her coat and a wooden shelf for her things. She set her books on the shelf first, then her spare set of clothes, then the small carved stone her mother had left her before she died. Her mother had been gone since Elara was 4. She didn't remember much about her, only a voice and a smell, and the feeling of being carried somewhere warm. She had kept the stone since she was old enough to be trusted not to lose it. She looked around the room for a long moment. Then she began to unpack properly, folding each item and placing it with care, because she had decided on the walk down from the main house that she was not going to fall apart. She was going to think. She was going to observe. She was going to keep every part of herself intact, because she had a feeling, quiet and strange and persistent, that she was going to need all of it. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were manageable. The work in the laundry hall was hard on the hands and repetitive, and the women she worked alongside were a mixed group. Some ignored her. Some were kind in a practical, no-fuss way. One older woman named Bess took it upon herself to show Elara the fastest way to wring out the heavy ceremonial linens without hurting her wrists, and she did it without comment and without pity, which Elara appreciated more than she could say. The hardest part was not the work. The hardest part was being seen. Every time a higher-ranked pack member walked through the laundry hall to drop something off, there was a moment, a very brief pause, where their eyes found her, and then slid away in a way that pretended they hadn't found her at all. She had been Garrett Voss's daughter. She had been expected. She had been pointed at during festivals by parents telling their children, "See that girl, watch her, she's going to be something to notice when she wakes up." Now they looked through her. She let them. She also, quietly and without drawing attention to it, began to read everything she could find. The pack had a small reading room near the main hall, open to all members regardless of rank. Most people never used it. The books were old and some of them were in a formal script that took time to decode, but she worked through them steadily during the hour she had to herself each evening. She read about pack history, about territory law, about the old bloodlines and their records. She read about the awakening ritual and its documented failures, which were even rarer than the elder had implied. 3 cases in 200 years. She read about what a hollow wolf was theorized to be, a body that carried wolf genetics but had no spirit bond, a biological fact with no spiritual element. She read the descriptions of hollow wolves carefully. She compared them to what she actually felt inside herself. They didn't match. A hollow wolf, according to the old texts, was described as feeling nothing, no pull, no inner warmth, no sense of something waiting. They described it as looking into a room and finding it empty. When Elara looked inward, the room was not empty. It was dark, but there was something in the dark. Something that breathed slowly and steadily and did not move. Something that felt, if she concentrated, almost like a sound just below the range of hearing. Not absent, present. Deeply, stubbornly, unmistakably present. She told no one. She went back to the reading room the next evening, and the one after that, and she kept reading. She didn't know what she was looking for exactly. She only knew that the answer to what lived inside her was not in any of the books on the standard shelves. So she looked for what was not on the standard shelves. She noted which volumes were placed spine in, which ones were dusty, in ways that suggested they'd been pushed to the back deliberately. Which sections of the reading room had clearly not been tidied in years. One evening, 6 weeks after her awakening, she was reaching for a high shelf when she noticed a gap between two large books, and in that gap, lying flat and forgotten, was a thin volume with no title on its spine. She took it down. It was hand-stitched, the pages yellowed and soft at the corners. The writing inside was in the old formal script, which she had by now become decent at reading. She opened it to the first page. The first line read, "The silver-veined are not awakened. They awaken the world around them." She stood there in the quiet reading room with the thin book open in her hands, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she felt something shift inside her. Not the golden warmth everyone described, not a wolf rising, something else. Something that moved slowly, and precisely, and with enormous weight, like a large door, deep underground, turning on its hinge. She closed the book carefully. She slipped it under her arm. She walked back to her small room, with the window that faced the northern forest. She sat on her bed and read every word inside that book 3 times over before the candle burned low. When she finally put it down, she did not feel victorious. She did not feel relief. She felt something much stranger and much more serious than either of those things. She felt chosen. Not by the pack, not by the elder, not by the ceremony or the ritual or the expectations of people who had already written her off. Chosen by something older than all of them. She set the book under her mattress, pressed her palms flat against the blanket, and looked at the wall. Outside, the northern forest was dark and still. Somewhere past the tree line, past the ridge and the valley beyond it, the 5 territories were carrying on as they always did. Packs woke and hunted and fought and bowed and pledged themselves to the king who ruled them all. She thought about the line in the book. She thought about what it meant. She thought about the night of the ceremony, and the way a single silver vein of light had run under the skin of her left forearm for just one moment, just one breath of a moment, before it vanished. She had thought she had imagined it. She was almost certain she hadn't. She lay down on her bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The candle went out. The room went dark. The northern forest was silent outside her window. Whatever was living inside her breathed slowly in the dark, patient, still, waiting. She let it wait. She did not sleep well that night, not because she was afraid, but because her mind would not stop moving. It kept turning the words over, kept reaching back to the ceremony, kept measuring the feeling inside her chest against the description in the book. The old text had said the silver-veined were different from ordinary wolves in every way. Not stronger in the sense of muscle or speed, but different at the root of things. Their gift was not a beast. It was something older, something the book called a truth force, a power that worked not through the body, but through a kind of deep clarity. She did not fully understand it yet, but she felt that she would. In the morning she rose before the sun, washed her face in the basin, and went to the laundry hall as she always did. Bess was already there, heating water over the fire and humming something low and tuneless. Elara took her place at the long basin and began her work without speaking. She liked the mornings when the hall was quiet. The steam rose, and the smell of soap filled the air, and there was a kind of simplicity to it that she had learned to appreciate, not because she had given up wanting more, but because she had learned that wanting more and being present where you were not the same fight. She was wringing out a length of heavy cloth when she heard the horn. It came from the northern watchpost, and it was not the deep, steady call that signaled a routine announcement. It was 3 short blasts followed by a long one. She had only ever heard that pattern once, when she was 9 years old, and the entire village had stopped moving for 30 full seconds before the panic started. That pattern meant royalty was coming. Bess dropped her humming and looked up. From outside, voices were already rising. Elara set down the cloth and moved to the doorway and looked out across the service yard. People were crossing the open ground quickly, heading toward the main gate, pulling on better clothes and fixing their hair as they moved. A child ran past and shouted to no one in particular that the king's riders had been spotted on the north road. Elara stepped back inside the laundry hall and picked up her cloth again. Bess looked at her. She said shouldn't they go to the gate as well? Elara said she supposed they probably should, eventually. But the cloth still needed wringing. She worked steadily, while the noise outside built and swelled. She felt the thing inside her shift again. That deep, slow movement, like the tide pulling back before something large came in. She had no idea yet just how right that feeling was. The king's procession came through the north gate just before midday. Elara heard it from the laundry hall, the heavy rhythm of hooves on packed earth, the creak and jangle of horses moving in tight formation, the sound of boots on stone as outriders dismounted and took their positions. She heard the silence that followed, which was somehow louder than any of the sounds before it, the kind of silence that a whole village makes when they are collectively holding their breath. She finished the section of linen she was working on, folded it over the drying rack, and dried her hands on the rough cloth hanging near the door. Then she walked outside. The main yard was lined on both sides with pack members standing in their rank order. The elders stood at the front with the alpha, a broad man named Gareth Cole, who was doing his best to look composed and not entirely succeeding. Elara found a place near the back of the crowd, beside one of the storage buildings where she could see without being particularly visible. She was good at that too, finding the angle that let her observe without drawing attention. She saw the horses first. They were large and dark, not the usual brown or dun of working animals, but a deep black that absorbed the midday light rather than reflecting it. There were 12 of them, arranged in a V formation, with one rider slightly ahead of the rest. The riders wore dark armor over black clothing, no emblem on their chest, no banner on their horses. Elara had always found it interesting that the most powerful man in the 5 territories apparently felt no need to advertise his arrival with color or pageantry. He arrived like a shadow. The lead rider dismounted. She had expected someone older. She had heard the king described as severe and cold and ancient in his cruelty, the way people described someone they were afraid of, layering the fear with extra years and extra weight to explain why the fear felt so large. She had imagined someone gray-haired and iron-faced, heavy with power. Alpha King Calum Drace was 26 years old and looked exactly like the kind of person who had never once been uncertain about anything. He was tall, with dark hair that had been cut short, and no decorative anything, no rings or pins or signs of ceremony. His face was composed in a way that was different from stillness. Stillness was the absence of movement. His face was something more deliberate than that. It was the face of a person who had at some point decided exactly how much of himself the world was allowed to see, and had not shifted that decision since. He walked toward Gareth Cole and Elder Dorn with the kind of pace that does not hurry and does not need to. He accepted the formal bow from the Alpha without any change in his expression. He said a few words that Elara could not hear from her position. Gareth nodded several times and gestured toward the main hall. And then, for a reason she could not explain, Calum Drace turned his head. He did not turn it fully. It was a slight angling, the kind of movement that was not a real turn at all, more like a readjustment, the way a person moves their gaze when something at the edge of their vision catches on something they did not expect. He looked in the direction of the storage building where Elara stood. She was behind 3 rows of taller people. There was no reason his eyes should have found her position at all. His gaze passed over the crowd. It did not stop. He turned back to Gareth and continued walking. Elara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The king's visit was announced as a dominance review, which was what it was officially called, though everyone understood what it actually was. Every 3 years, Calum Drace traveled through the territories and spent 2 or 3 days in each major pack settlement. He met with the Alpha, reviewed the pack's numbers and resources, accepted the loyalty pledge from ranking members, and left. It was tradition that went back 4 generations. It had originally been done to ensure that packs were not growing too powerful, not stockpiling weapons or building alliances that could threaten the central throne. That original concern had long since faded into ceremony, but the visits continued, because that was what power did. It maintained itself. The pack spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of controlled anxiety. Servants moved extra furniture into the main hall to accommodate the king's guard, who would eat and sleep there for the duration. The kitchens began preparing meals far more elaborate than usual. 2 junior pack members were sent to scrub the ceremonial courtyard stones on their hands and knees. Elara was assigned to assist with water service during the evening's formal welcome dinner. She carried a large clay pitcher and kept it filled at the table where the king's guard sat. She moved quietly and efficiently, the way she had learned to do everything in the past 6 weeks, without drawing attention, without hesitating, without telegraphing her presence any more than necessary. The hall was full of noise, voices overlapping, the scrape of chairs, the smell of roasted meat, and wood smoke from the fires at either end of the long room. The king sat at a smaller table near the head of the hall, with Gareth and the elder and 2 of his senior guard. He did not eat much. He listened more than he spoke. She noticed this because she was watching, carefully, the way she watched everything. She was walking toward the long table to refill her pitcher from the barrel near the wall, when her foot caught the edge of an uneven flagstone. It happened fast, the slight lurch forward, her hands going out, the pitcher tilting. She righted herself immediately. She caught the pitcher before it tilted far enough to spill. Her hand had come down hard on the edge of the table, and the pitcher had jerked, but she controlled it. She steadied her footing, and adjusted her grip, and prepared to keep walking. And then a hand closed over hers on the handle of the pitcher. It was not her own hand. It was larger, and the grip was fast and precise, the kind of reflex that belonged to someone who had trained their hands to react before their mind finished processing the situation. She looked up. Calum Drace had moved from his table to hers in the time it took her to recover from the stumble, and he was standing close enough that she could see the fine details of his collar, and his hand was over hers on the pitcher handle, and he was looking at her. She looked back. She did not drop the pitcher. She did not flinch or apologize or look down the way she probably should have. She simply held his gaze, with the same steady composure she had been using to get through the past 6 weeks of her life, because it was the only tool she had left that was entirely her own. His hand left the pitcher. The whole exchange had taken perhaps 4 seconds. He said nothing. She gave a small nod, the appropriate acknowledgement of a service-ranked member when a higher-ranked individual crossed into her space. Then she continued to the barrel and refilled the pitcher. When she turned back, he had returned to his table. He was speaking to Gareth again. His face was the same composed surface it had been all evening. There was no sign that anything had happened. Except that twice in the next half hour, when she moved around the edge of the hall, she felt his attention find her, with the same quality it had in the yard, that slight, precise angling. Not a stare, more like a calculation. The kind of focus a careful person directs at something they have not yet decided what to do with. She ignored it as best she could, and finished her work. She was washing the clay pitcher in the service basin behind the hall, when one of the king's guard came to find her. He was a quiet man with a long face and no particular expression, and he said simply that the king required someone to bring fresh water to his chamber before he retired, and the usual attendant had been pulled for another task. He asked if she could do it. She said she could. She carried a fresh pitcher and a folded cloth up to the room the pack had given Calum for his stay, a large corner room on the upper floor of the main hall building that was normally reserved for distinguished visitors. She knocked. A voice said to enter. She went in and set the pitcher on the small table near the window, placed the cloth beside it, and turned to leave. Stop. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the quality of something that had never once been disobeyed. She stopped. Turn around. She turned. He was sitting in the chair by the window, with one arm resting on the windowsill, looking at her. Not the way people sometimes looked at service staff, through them or past them. He was looking directly at her face, with the full weight of his attention. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elara Voss," she said. "Voss." He repeated it as if measuring something. "The pack register lists you as service-ranked. You were not born into service rank." She said nothing. He had not asked a question. "You were registered as warrior class at birth, through your father's line," he said, "reassigned 6 weeks ago following the awakening ceremony." He paused. "You did not awaken." "No," she said. "What did you feel during the ceremony?" She looked at him. The question was unexpected. No one had asked her that. Elder Dorn had asked her if she felt anything, a yes or no question that she had answered with no, because saying what she actually felt would have required more trust than she had. Calum Drace was not asking yes or no. He was asking what, and there was something in the precision of the question that made her think he would notice if she gave him a lesser answer. "I felt something," she said, "but it was nothing like what the awakening is supposed to produce." His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. It was subtle and brief, and she almost missed it. "What did it feel like?" he said. She considered how honest to be with the most powerful person in the 5 territories, while standing alone in his room at night. She considered the options available to her and the likely consequences of each one. She decided on the truth. "It felt like something very large and very deep," she said, that was not yet ready to move. The silence afterward was long. The fire in the small grate at the wall crackled once. Outside, the night wind moved through the trees beyond the village. Calum Drace was still looking at her. The expression on his face had not shifted into anything readable, but the set of his jaw had changed slightly, and his hand on the windowsill had gone very still. "You may go," he said. She went. She walked down the stairs and through the back hall, and out into the cold night air, and stood in the service yard for a moment, with her head tipped back, and the stars very clear, and very far above her. She breathed once, slowly. She noticed that her hands were completely steady. She thought about his face when she had described the thing inside her. She thought about the way the question had been framed. Not whether she had felt anything, what she had felt. As if he already knew the answer to the first question, and was only interested in the detail of the second. She thought about this for a long time before going inside. In his room on the upper floor, Calum Drace sat in the chair by the window, and did not move for several minutes after she left. In his chest, something that had been locked away, and silent, and utterly still for 2.5 years, turned over like a stone at the bottom of a river, caught in a current that had not existed an hour ago. His wolf. His other self, the part of him that he had shut down after the northern forest, after the night that he had refused to think about completely since the morning he had woken from it, shifted once in the dark of him, and went still again. But it did not go back to sleep. He looked at his hand, the one that had moved to catch the pitcher. He had not thought about doing it. He had simply done it, the way you reach for something before you know you're reaching, fast and precise, and without a single moment of deliberation. That had not happened to him in a very long time either. He turned back to the window and looked out over the Ashvale village, with its quiet lights and its sloped paths, and its northern forest dark beyond the rooftops. He sat there for a long time, still and quiet, with the look of a man working through a problem that was more complex than it first appeared. He did not sleep much that night, but for the first time in longer than he cared to count, the sleeplessness was not because of shadows. It was because of a question he could not stop turning over. What it felt like. Something very large and very deep that was not yet ready to move. He had heard those words before, or something very close to them. He had read them, years ago, in a text so old that the paper had crumbled at the corners when he turned the pages. A text that his grandfather had locked away, and that he had found during the first year of his reign, when he had spent 3 months systematically going through every sealed archive in Drace Keep. He had read those words and thought them interesting and moved on, because at that point they had seemed like history, like something that was over. He was beginning to wonder if he had been wrong about that. Morning came gray and damp. Elara rose before the others in the service quarter and went to her window. Fog sat low over the northern forest, and the village was still quiet, the kind of quiet that exists only in the hour before the world decides to wake up and begin being demanding again. She had slept better than expected. Not deeply, but cleanly. She had a sense, vague but persistent, that something had moved in her life, the way a ship moves when the wind shifts. Not a storm, just a change in direction. She could not have said what it meant. She only knew that the night before had not been nothing. She pulled on her work clothes and folded the book she had been reading, the old hand-stitched one, back beneath her mattress. She did this carefully, pressing down the edges of the mattress with the same deliberate attention she gave everything now. The book was the only thing she was protecting. Everything else she was willing to lose if she had to. She went down to the laundry hall. Bess was there, as always, already heating water. They worked together for an hour without speaking. There was a comfort in it. Then the door to the hall opened and one of the senior pack guards stepped in. A man named Owen, whose shoulders were always too tense and who had never, in Elara's experience, delivered news that was good. He looked at her and said the king had requested the full pack roster for individual review, and that all members were to present themselves in the main hall by the mid-morning bell, including service quarter staff. He said it with the tone of a man following instructions he did not fully understand, and then he left. Bess looked at Elara. Elara looked at the cloth in her hands. She set it down over the drying rack and smoothed it flat. The physician did not speak about what he had seen. Elara knew this because she watched him for the rest of the morning. She watched the way he moved through the remaining examinations, with the careful efficiency of a man who had decided to behave normally until he was given permission to do otherwise. She watched him pack his instruments with deliberate care, not hurrying, not dawdling. She watched the king's senior guard stay close to him the entire time, not threateningly, but consistently, the way a large shadow stays consistent, regardless of where you move. The results were being buried. She understood this without anyone telling her. What she didn't understand yet was why. She spent the afternoon in the laundry hall as usual. She worked without speaking more than necessary, and thought through everything she knew, which was not as little as most people assumed. The things she had found in the old hand-stitched book had told her something about the silver-veined bloodline. What it had not told her was enough. She needed more. She needed the kind of information that was not in the public reading room, the kind that was kept somewhere else, somewhere with a closed door, and a reason for the closing. She thought about the reading room. She thought about the back shelves with the spine-turned books. She thought about the section she had not yet fully explored, the one in the far left corner that sat behind a heavy wooden chair that nobody had moved in what looked like years. That evening, after the service hall had eaten and the king's party had retired for the night, she went to the reading room. She moved the heavy wooden chair. Behind it were 5 volumes, all lying flat, all covered in the same fine pale dust that accumulates on things that have not been touched with any intention in a long time. She took all 5 down and carried them to the table and opened the first one. It was a genealogical record. She recognized the format from the official pack registers she had seen in the main hall, but this one was older and broader, covering not just Ashvale but several packs and, she realized as she turned the pages, some bloodlines that predated the current territorial structure entirely. She found the silver vein entry on the 43rd page. It was short, shorter than it should have been. The entry began in the normal way, listing founding members and lineage, and then it became very sparse very quickly, and then it stopped, and there was a note at the bottom in a different hand, a later hand, that read, "Line terminated. No surviving members. The 3rd month of the year of the Grey Winter." She turned to the second book. It was a record of territorial disputes. She set it aside. The 3rd book was what she had been hoping for without knowing it. It was a history of the bloodlines, written by someone who had clearly had access to documents that no longer existed publicly. The author was not named. The text was careful but not cold, the writing of someone who wanted to preserve something true. She read through it quickly, and then more slowly on the sections that mattered. The Silver Vein line had not produced ordinary wolves. The text was clear about this. Where wolf bloodlines manifested as a shift, an inner beast, a second self that could take physical form, the Silver Vein gift was different in kind, not just degree. It was described as a truth force, a sovereignty of perception, the ability to see what was real beneath what was presented, and to hold that clarity in a way that could not be manipulated or overridden. Silver-veined individuals could not be compelled by an alpha's command. They could not be dominated by pack hierarchy in the conventional sense. Their blood itself responded to silver, the element that wolves were typically weakened by, as if they had absorbed it and made it part of themselves. They were immune to silver's effects. More than immune. They could channel it. The massacre in the Grey Winter had not been, as the official pack histories described it, a conflict between the Silver Vein line and the throne over territorial boundaries. She read the real account with a steady face and very still hands. The Silver Vein elders had refused to submit to the new king, Calum Drace's grandfather, Aldrich I, not because they wanted territory or power, but because they recognized something in him that their gifts showed them clearly, something about his intentions toward the southern packs, something that the official histories had smoothed over and renamed and filed elsewhere. They had refused to bow to a man their blood told them could not be trusted, and he had killed every one of them that he could find. Not all. Apparently not all. She sat very still at the reading table for a long moment. The fire in the small reading room hearth had burned down to coals. The light was orange and low. She thought about her mother, gone since she was 4. She thought about the stone carving her mother had left her, which she had always assumed was a piece of ordinary sentiment. She thought about the shape on the stone, which she had rubbed with her thumb 1,000 times and never fully looked at, the way you stop truly seeing things you've had too long. She went back to her room. She took the stone from the shelf. She held it under the small oil lamp by her bed and looked at it properly for the first time. The shape carved into it was a vein of silver threading through the stone, running from one edge to the other, like a bloodline through a family, like something that moved underground and came up somewhere unexpected. She put the stone down very carefully on the shelf. She went to the window. The northern forest was dark and still. She pressed her palms flat against the window frame and breathed. The thing inside her moved, slowly, with enormous patience, but it moved, and this time it did not stop as quickly as before. It turned, very slowly, the way something large turns when it has finally decided that waiting is over. She pulled her hands back from the frame. Where her palms had been, on the wooden surface, there were two faint marks. Not burns. Something else. A silver trace, barely visible, already fading, as if her hands had briefly been lit from inside. She stared at them until they were completely gone. Then she folded her hands in her lap and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about everything she now knew. What she knew was this. She was not hollow. She was not a failed wolf. She was the last living member of a bloodline that a king had tried to erase because it could see through him. And the grandson of that king was currently sleeping upstairs in the main hall of the pack that had thrown her away. She thought about coincidence. She thought about whether she believed in it. She decided she did not. The next morning came ordinary and gray, fog again over the trees, the familiar smell of the laundry hall, Bess heating water and humming her tuneless song. Alara took her place at the basin and began working. She let her mind run quietly through the day's logic. The king was scheduled to leave on the third day. Today was the second day. She had roughly 24 hours before the man who held all the answers to her questions about her own existence rode out through the north gate and went back to his keep, which was, by her estimate from the territorial maps she had studied in the reading room, 6 days' ride from here. She needed to decide what she was going to do with that information. She was wringing out a heavy length of cloth when the door to the laundry hall opened, for the second time in 2 days, in an unexpected way. Not Owen with his too tight shoulders. This time it was a guard she didn't know, younger, with the king's pack emblem on his collar. He looked around the hall until he found her. He said the king requested her presence in the meeting room adjacent to the main hall, and that she should come now. Bess did not look up from her work, but her hands slowed slightly. Alara set down the cloth. She dried her hands. She followed the guard out of the hall and across the yard and through the side entrance of the main building, through the narrow corridor that smelled of old wood and lamp oil, and into the meeting room, which was small and had a table and 4 chairs, and a fire already burning in the grate. The king was already there, standing at the window with his back to her. The guard closed the door and remained outside it. She heard his footsteps move away down the corridor. They were alone. Calum turned from the window. He looked at her for a moment in silence. Then he said, "Sit down." She sat. He did not sit. He moved to the fireplace and stood with one arm on the mantel and looked at the fire for a moment before turning his attention back to her. He had the look of a man who had been turning something over for many hours and had arrived at a position he did not fully like, but had accepted anyway. "What do you know about the Silver Vein bloodline?" he said. She met his gaze steadily. There was no point in pretending. He had ordered the blood test. He had seen the results. He had not exposed her or had her removed from the hall. He had kept it quiet, and now he was asking her directly. He was offering her a conversation, which was more than she had expected from the most powerful and reportedly most ruthless person in the 5 territories. She told him what she had found in the reading room. Not all of it. The parts that he likely already knew. She watched his face as she spoke. It did not move much, but it moved in the right places, confirming, and adding weight to things she had guessed at rather than confirmed. When she finished, he said, "Who told you the massacre was my grandfather's order?" "The history in the Pack's restricted archive," she said. "That archive is supposed to be inaccessible to service staff." "The chair blocking it was very heavy," she said. "But not impossible." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, but adjacent to one, as if the muscles remembered the shape without quite completing it. "How much of the old text could you read?" he asked. "All of it," she said. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said something she had not expected. He said, "I have been trying to find the last Silver Vein member for 3 years. The records I found in the sealed archives of Drace Keep described a child, female, removed from the compound the night before the massacre. Taken north. The trail went cold in the Ashvale territory." She did not speak. "You were 4 years old when your mother died," he said. It was not a question. She held his gaze. Her hands, folded in her lap, were completely still. The thing inside her breathed slowly, its enormous patience coiled and waiting. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. He looked back at the fire. "I need you to understand," he said quietly, "that what I tell you next stays in this room until I say otherwise. Not because I am threatening you, because what I am about to do could get both of us killed if it is known before I am ready." She looked at the fire with him. She said she understood. He told her. He told her all of it, the sealed records, his grandfather's decree, the reason the Silver Vein line had refused to submit, what they had seen in Aldrich I that had made them choose death over loyalty. He told her what he had found about his grandfather's actions in the southern packs, what had truly happened in the years after the massacre. He told her in the flat, careful voice of a man reciting things he had spent years being very precise about, because imprecision had costs he could not afford. He told her that he had known for 3 years that a survivor existed. He had not come to Ashvale to review the pack's loyalty. He had come because of a single record in the old registry that placed a woman named Ava Voss in this settlement in the year of the Grey Winter. A woman with silver-traced handwriting on a legal document that matched no other sample in the archives, because silver-veined individuals left traces in ways they didn't always intend to. Alara thought about the wooden window frame in her room. She thought about the faint silver marks she had pressed into it without meaning to. She looked at Calum Drace. She said, "What do you want from me?" He turned from the fire and looked at her with the full weight of that precise, contained attention. "I want to take you out of this pack," he said. "I want to bring you to Drace Keep, and I want to do it in a way that no one who should not know about it will know about it, which means it needs to happen before tomorrow morning, and it needs to look like something it isn't." She looked back at him for a moment. Then she said, "All right." He blinked. "Just once. That's your answer?" "I have a book under my mattress in the service quarter," she said. "I'd like to take it with me." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man recalculating something. Then he said she could have an hour to collect her things. She stood up, smoothed her work clothes, and headed for the door. Her hand was on the latch when he spoke again. "Ilara." She stopped. "The thing inside you," he said. "Has it moved since the ceremony?" She looked at the door in front of her. She thought about the window frame. She thought about the faint silver on her palms. "Yes," she said. A silence. "Good," he said quietly. She went out. She packed in 7 minutes. It did not take long because she had very little. The book, the stone, the spare clothes, a small leather pouch with the few coins she had earned in the laundry hall. She stood in the center of her small room for a moment after she finished and looked at it. The window facing the northern forest, the firm mattress, the hook on the wall. It had been small, and it had been a demotion, and she had spent 6 weeks finding her footing inside it, and she felt no particular attachment to leaving it, and no particular grief about it either. It had been a place to exist in while she figured out what came next. What came next, apparently, was something she had not predicted, which was a fair description of every significant thing that had ever happened to her. She walked out without looking back. The guard who had come to the laundry hall was waiting in the yard, with 2 horses and a saddlebag. He did not speak to her. She tied her small pack to the second saddle and mounted without assistance. She had learned to ride on her father's older horse when she was 8. She was competent, if not elegant. Calum came out of the main building a few minutes later with 2 of his senior guard. He had changed into plain riding clothes, dark and without insignia, the same as the others. If you had not known who he was, you might have taken him for a private courier or a territorial ranger. He mounted his horse with the ease of someone who had spent a great deal of his life on horseback and had no particular feelings about it either way. He looked at her once. She looked back. He clicked his horse forward, and the small group rode quietly out through the eastern gate, which was the gate used for supply deliveries and routine pack business, and was not the main gate where a royal departure would be expected and noticed and discussed afterward. The gate guard did not react beyond opening it and closing it again behind them. Drace Keep was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something cold and severe, which it was, but she had not imagined its particular kind of severity. It was not the severity of neglect or decay. It was the severity of a place that had been built with absolute certainty about what it needed to be, and had never once reconsidered. The keep sat embedded in the black volcanic stone of the central ridge, not perched on top of it like the fortresses in the old storybooks, but grown into it, as if the ridge and the building had decided at some point to become the same thing. The walls were the same color as the rock around them. The towers did not soar upward decoratively. They rose only as high as they needed to, and no higher. Everything about it communicated that the people inside were not interested in impressing anyone. They were interested in not being moved. They had been riding for 6 days. The journey had been quiet and uneventful in the way that Calum Drace's presence seemed to make things quiet and uneventful. When they stopped at inns, rooms were produced immediately. When they rode through villages on the main road, people moved out of the way, with a speed that suggested they had recognized something. Not the man specifically, but the quality of him. The space he took up in a room was not about his size. It was about the impression he gave, that he had already considered every possible outcome of being in this room, and had decided which ones were acceptable. He spoke to her more on the road than she had expected. Not warmly, not in a way that sought anything personal, but directly and informatively, the way a person briefs someone they intend to work with. He told her about the keep's structure, which sections were accessible to which people and why. He told her about the territorial council, which met at the keep 4 times a year. He told her about the 3 high lords who posed the greatest complications, and he described each of them in terms of motivation rather than personality, which she found more useful than the alternative would have been. He told her that she would be registered as a ward of the crown, which was a legal designation that gave her protection and placed her directly under his authority, meaning no pack could claim her. She asked him once, on the 4th morning, why he was bothering. She did not mean it rudely. She meant it practically. She was one person. She had a bloodline that most packs had never heard of, and that the ones who had heard of it associated with something dangerous. She could not shift. She had no pack loyalty, no rank, no political value that she could see. What she had was unusual blood, and some old books, and the ability to stay calm when most people would not. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because my grandfather made a mistake that cost the 5 territories something they did not know they needed. I have spent 3 years trying to understand what he took from them. I am not in the habit of leaving problems unsolved." She thought about this. "You think I'm a solution," she said. "I think you might be something the territories have not had in 200 years, he said. "Whether that is a solution or a complication, I haven't decided yet." She considered that fair. The first evening in Drace Keep she spent mostly alone, which was what she needed. The room she had been given was large, far larger than anything she had had before, with a high ceiling and stone floors covered with woven rugs, and a window that faced east, toward the forest that ran along the base of the ridge. The bed had thick blankets. There was a writing desk and a lamp and bookshelves, which were empty. She liked that they were empty. It meant they were waiting for something. She put her book and her stone on the desk, looked at the empty shelves, and thought about how long it would take to fill them. The keep had a staff of 30 people, not including the guard, which numbered 84. She learned this not from being told, but from listening, and counting over the first 3 days. She was good at both. The staff were not unfriendly to her, but they were careful, which was reasonable. She was an unknown quantity in a place that had learned to be cautious about unknown quantities. The person who was least careful around her was a woman named Clara, who was in charge of the keep's supply records, and who had the kind of practical intelligence that expressed itself in an absolute indifference to social rank. Clara was in her 40s, and had worked in the keep for 20 years, and apparently found the arrival of unusual people more interesting than concerning. She introduced herself to Alara on the 2nd morning, handed her a cup of tea without asking if she wanted one, and said she supposed Alara had a lot of questions about how things worked around here. Alara said she did. Clara spent an hour answering them, in the practical, no-nonsense way that Bess back in the laundry hall had shown her how to wring linens. She told Alara which parts of the keep were freely accessible and which required the king's personal clearance. She told her that the restricted archive on the lower level had only been accessed twice in 3 years, and both times by Calum himself. She told her, without particular emphasis, that the room Alara had been given had previously belonged to a woman named Veda, who had been a council advisor and who had died in the incident in the northern forest 2 years ago. Alara asked, carefully, what the incident in the northern forest had been. Clara looked at her with a measured expression and said that nobody talked about that, and that she meant nobody in the sense of the word that meant absolutely not anyone at all. and that the king had made it clear on the matter's single official discussion that it was not to be referred to in any form. Ilara thanked her and changed the subject. That evening she went looking for the portrait. She had noticed it on her first walk through the upper corridor, a painting hanging on the corridor wall, in the manner of all the other keep portraits, which showed various territorial figures from the past 100 years. Most portraits faced outward. This one had been turned around on its hook so that only the plain wooden back of the frame was visible. She had noted it without reacting, and kept walking, and now she came back to it when the corridor was empty. She looked at the back of the frame for a moment, then she turned it around. The woman in the portrait was perhaps 22 or 23, dark hair, eyes that, even in the flattened medium of paint, suggested a precision of intelligence. She was not smiling, but she did not look stern either. She looked like a person who was being painted because someone wanted to remember something about her specifically, not just her appearance but the way she occupied a room. Ilara looked at the portrait for a long moment. She noted the woman's hands, where the painter had spent extra care, and the suggestion of something faint and silver-toned along the veins of her wrist that might have been a lighting choice, or might have been something else. She turned the portrait back around the way she had found it, and went back to her room. She sat at the writing desk with the lamp on, and thought about Calum Drace. She thought about the northern forest and the thing nobody talked about. She thought about his wolf, which she had heard described in passing by two of the senior guards, in a tone that suggested the wolf's current state was something they found deeply disquieting. She thought about how a man who had been described to her before she ever met him as unmoved and unreachable had moved to catch a pitcher before it fell, and asked her what it felt like, and driven 6 days through the territories, to put her in a room that had belonged to someone he could not bring himself to let other people mention. She thought, he is not cold. He has simply learned to put his warmth somewhere no one can reach it. She thought about whether she was going to be the kind of person who was satisfied leaving things where they were buried. She looked at the empty bookshelves. She looked at the writing desk. She thought about the archive Clara had mentioned, the restricted one on the lower level that Calum had accessed twice, and apparently no one else had been near. She turned the lamp down and went to bed. She lay in the large room in the dark, and thought about timelines. She had been in the keep 3 days. She had learned the supply routes, the staff schedule, the guard rotation, and the location of 3 separate archive sections. She had identified the blind spot in the lower-level patrol that occurred every evening between the 7th and 8th hour, when the watch changed, and the corridor near the archive was unwatched, for approximately 4 minutes. She had not yet used it. She was being patient. She was being careful. She was giving the place time to feel familiar before she began pushing on its edges. But she had noted the 4 minutes. She had been noting things like that her whole life, and now that she finally knew what she was, and what her blood carried, and what had been stolen from her line 200 years ago, she intended to use every tool she had. Whatever was living inside her turned slowly in the dark, and she turned with it, and somewhere in the keep's lower stones, the restricted archive sat in its locked room, and waited. She thought about her timeline. 3 more days, perhaps 4, before she would feel ready to move. She closed her eyes. She slept. She did not dream. 3 days became 4, and 4 became 5, and on the evening of the 5th day, she used the 4-minute window. The lower level of the keep was cut directly into the rock of the ridge. The walls were stone, and the floors were stone, and the lamps were set at intervals that left the spaces between them genuinely dark. She had a small hand lamp, the kind that could be shuttered to a thin line of light. She moved quickly and quietly through the lower corridor, counting her steps, listening to the silence behind her for any change. The archive door was iron-fitted oak, thick and old. It had a lock that she had spent 3 evenings studying from a distance during her brief periods of access to the lower level, for approved reasons. She had borrowed a thin wire from the supply room that was officially used for binding document bundles. She had never picked a lock before. She had read about the mechanism in a technical text in the reading room back in Ashvale, and had spent 2 evenings in her room working out the logic of it. It took her 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The archive was smaller than she had expected. 1 room, not large, with 3 walls of shelving and a central table. The shelves were organized by date and type. She knew what she was looking for because she had been specific with herself about it. She wanted the original massacre record, not the sanitized territorial version she had found in Ashvale's hidden books, but the primary account, the order itself if it existed, and anything that described what the Silver Vein elders had seen in Aldrich I that had made them refuse him. She found the massacre order in a sealed case on the second shelf, the original document, handwritten, with Aldrich's seal pressed into the wax at the bottom. She read it standing at the table with her shuttered lamp open just wide enough. It was cold, and it was clear, and it was, in the way of official orders, impersonal. It referred to the Silver Vein members as a territorial threat. It used formal language to describe their execution as a matter of security. There was not a single word in it that acknowledged what they had actually done, which was see something true and refuse to pretend otherwise. Beneath the sealed case was a second document, this one unsealed, in a different hand. She recognized the paper as the same type as the sealed orders, the same era. She picked it up. It was a letter, written by someone inside the Silver Vein community to a person outside it, apparently in the days before the massacre. The writer did not give their name, but they described what the elders had seen in Aldrich with the specific, unflinching clarity that she was beginning to understand was the Silver Vein way of communicating truth, not with drama, not with hysteria, but with precision. They had seen in him an intention to use the Southern Pax as labor, not as people. They had seen the plans already forming for what he would do to the Pack territories over the following decade. They had seen, with the clear sight that Silver Blood gave them, that his submission demands were not about unity but about control, and that control of this particular kind had no endpoint. They had told him this. They had said they would not swear loyalty to a man whose intentions they could see, and he had ordered their deaths the next morning. She set the letter down. She looked at the archive wall for a moment. Then she looked at the third document in the case, which she had almost missed because it was folded inside the first sealed order. It was short, 3 lines, in the same hand as the massacre order. It said, "The child was not found. The Ashvale line will be watched. If she surfaces, bring her to the throne quietly." The child had been known to be a girl. Her mother had not simply fled with her. Her mother had been running from a specific search. She had taken her daughter to the edge of the 5 territories and hidden herself in a plain pack under a plain name and died before anyone could find her, and the girl had grown up in a service quarter with no wolf and an ember of something ancient and enormous, slowly working out whether it was safe enough to burn. Ilara folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her coat. She replaced the documents and the sealed case. She relocked the archive behind her. She was back in her room in 7 minutes from start to finish, sitting at the writing desk with the letter open in front of her and the lamp turned low. She read it again. She read it a third time. She was not reading it to find something she had missed. She was reading it to settle into the reality of it, the way you settle into cold water, slowly and with intention, so your body can adjust to the temperature rather than going into shock. She had been searched for. She had been hidden. Her mother had kept her safe with the only tools available: distance, a different name, an ordinary life, in an unimportant place. Her mother had known exactly what Ilara was, and had wrapped her in smallness and invisibility until the day she died, because smallness and invisibility were the only armor she had. And it had worked. For 22 years, it had worked. Now Ilara sat in the keep of the grandson of the man who had ordered her bloodline destroyed, and the grandson was not his grandfather, which she was becoming more certain of with every day, and she had Silver Blood and an old gift waking slowly inside her, and a letter in her coat that proved the throne had known about her all along. She thought about what to do with all of it. She knocked on his study door at the end of the second week. He said to enter. She entered. The study was large and spare, a desk that held documents and nothing else, 2 chairs near the window, a map of the 5 territories fixed to the wall, with small iron pins marking points she had been mentally cataloging every time she passed the open door. He was reading something. He did not look up immediately. She sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited to. She had noticed early on that he responded better to directness than to deference, and she had decided to operate accordingly. He looked up. She told him she had been to the restricted archive. The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that happens when a person is deciding how to respond to something that has surprised them. He set down the document in his hand. He looked at her with an expression that was not anger and not quite something else either. "How?" he said. "The lock mechanism responds to lateral pressure on the second pin before the first," she said. I read about it in a technical compendium, and the guard change leaves 4 minutes unobserved on the lower level, between the 7th and 8th hour. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "What did you take?" "A letter. I'll show you which one." I photographed the position of every document before I touched anything and replaced them accurately. She paused. "I also left everything locked. From the outside, it looks as it did." He was quiet again. She could see him processing, not the fact of what she had done, but the implications of it. She had accessed his most secure archive. She had done it without assistance, without technology beyond a piece of wire, without prior experience with locks of that type, and she had apparently done it well enough that he would not have known if she hadn't told him. "Why are you telling me?" he asked. "Because I found something you should know about," she said, "and because I've decided to trust you, which means being honest about my methods, even when the methods are inconvenient." Something shifted in his face. Not a large shift, but she was getting better at reading the small ones. "What did you find?" he said. She told him about the letter. She told him about the 3 lines at the bottom of the massacre order. She watched his face while she described it, and saw something she had not expected, not surprise but a kind of heavy recognition, the face of someone hearing a confirmation of something they had suspected, but hoped was not true. He stood up from his desk. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her for a moment. Then he said, without turning around, "My grandfather knew about you specifically. He knew the child was female. He had the Ashvale pack watched." "Yes," she said. "For 22 years. "Yes." He turned around. His expression was composed in the way that she had come to recognize was not coldness but containment. He was holding something that was difficult to hold. "The watch was discontinued 6 years ago," he said. "I discontinued it when I found the original order and understood what it was. I thought the search had been dropped by that point and never properly closed. I did not know it was still active." He paused. "I am telling you this, so you understand that I was not watching Ashvale because of you. I did not know your location. I found you through the blood test results when I was already there for the review." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "How?" "Because if you had known exactly where I was, you would not have needed the blood test," she said. "And because a man who drives 6 days into the territories to bring a person to safety does not have the interests of someone who also ordered that person followed." He held her gaze. The silence between them was a different quality than it had been before. There was less calculation in it, more weight. The kind of weight that comes from 2 people occupying the same truth at the same time. "You trust easily," he said. "I don't trust at all," she said. "I observed carefully, and came to a conclusion. There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then, without warning, and without any particular ceremony, he sat back down, and told her something she had not asked for. He told her about Veda. He said her name once, in the same flat, careful voice he used for everything. He said she had been a council advisor, the best one he had ever had, and that she had died in the incident in the northern forest, and that the incident had been an ambush organized by one of the High Lords who had since been dealt with, but that the dealing with it had come too late for Veda. He did not embellish. He did not ask for sympathy. He presented it the way he presented everything, with precision and without ornament, and she understood that the absence of ornament was the truest version of what he felt about it, because people who feel things very deeply often run out of words that are adequate and choose silence over inadequacy. She said she was sorry. She meant it. He nodded once. Then he returned to the subject of the archive, and told her which sections she could now access openly, and which she still could not, and why, and she accepted these boundaries as reasonable because they were. They spent the rest of the hour going over what she had found, and what it meant for the territorial record, and she brought out the folded letter and showed him, and he read it, and his jaw went tight in the way it did when something struck him as particularly unacceptable, and then he set it down, and said it would be added to the formal record correction he was already preparing. She asked about the record correction. He told her about it. He had been building a case for 3 years, a formal re-examination of the territorial histories from the time of Aldrich I, to be presented to the Territorial Council. It was the kind of thing that could not be done quickly, if it was to be done permanently. You did not overturn 2 centuries of official history with a speech. You did it with evidence, organized and presented in a way that was irrefutable, and you did it in a context where the people who needed to accept it had been given no reasonable alternative. She looked at the map on his wall. She looked at the iron pins. She thought about what that kind of work required. "You've been doing this alone," she said. He didn't answer immediately. "Yes." "Why?" He picked up his document again. "Because I trust the people in this keep to do their jobs well," he said. "I don't trust most of them to handle this particular information without making it smaller than it is." She thought about this. She thought about a man who had been running a kingdom since he was 23, who had inherited a throne from a grandfather whose legacy he was spending his reign quietly dismantling, who had lost the one person he had apparently trusted with the full weight of what he was trying to do. She thought about what it cost to carry something that large by yourself for that long. She said, "I can help you." He looked at her over the document. She saw that calculation again, but it was different now, less guarded. "You haven't finished waking up yet," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I can work while I'm still waking. And you've been doing this alone for 3 years, and you're a good 3 years past when you needed assistance." He held her gaze. "That's direct," he said. "You told me the first day that you respond to direct," she said. "You didn't say it, but I noticed." He set the document down again. The late afternoon light from the window was falling across the desk between them, and there was a particular quality to it, warm and angled, the kind of light that shows you the real color of things, rather than the surface of them. He said, "What do you know about territorial council procedure?" She had been reading about it for 10 days from the keep's open archives. She told him what she knew. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said there were 3 things she had wrong, and he corrected them, and she noted the corrections and filed them away. Then he pushed one of the stacks of documents to her side of the desk, and said that if she intended to help, she could start with the chronological cross-referencing of the 3rd and 4th decades of Aldrich's reign, because that was where the most important evidence sat, and it was the section he had been putting off, because it required holding 2 very large sets of documents in your head simultaneously, and making connections between them, which was slow work even for a careful person. She pulled the stack toward her. She opened the first document. She began reading. He watched her for a moment, and she felt that watching, but kept her attention on the page, and then he turned back to his own work, and they sat together, in the late afternoon light, with the territorial map on the wall, and the iron pins marking all the places that the past had gone wrong, and worked. They worked until the light went. Clara brought food at some point, which neither of them acknowledged until it had gone cold, and then both of them ate it cold without comment, and they worked some more, and when Alara finally left, it was 3 hours past when she would normally have gone to bed. She walked through the corridor to her room, in the dark and quiet keep. She was tired in the specific and satisfying way that comes from work that matters. She had filled 4 pages of careful notes. She had found 2 connections in the documents that she pointed out to him, and he had gone still, in the way that meant he was recalculating something, and both times he had said, quietly, "Yes," and made a notation. She had felt, both times, a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the thing inside her, and everything to do with the ordinary human satisfaction of being useful to someone who recognizes the quality of what you've given them. She went to her room. She changed her clothes in the dark. She stood at the window for a moment and felt the thing inside her, slower and deeper now, a tide rather than a tremor. Patient, building. She put her palms against the window frame. The silver thread ran under her skin, and she let it, gently, without reaching for it, without pushing. She just let it breathe. Outside, the eastern forest was dark and quiet and enormous. Somewhere out there were 5 territories, and a history that had been wrong for 200 years, and a council that would have to be shown the truth, with enough care and enough evidence that they could not pretend they hadn't seen it. She felt, for the first time since the ceremony, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because someone had decided that for her, because she had looked at all the available information and concluded it herself. She went to bed. She slept deeply. She did not wake until morning. The days after that took on a shape. Morning began with her own study of the keep's open archives, which held more than she had initially assumed. Afternoon was split between working alongside Clara on the supply records, which gave her an ongoing reason to move through the lower level and maintain her sense of the keep's operational rhythms, and the reading room on the upper floor, which held a large collection of territorial histories that she was working through systematically. Evening, 3 or 4 nights out of 7, she went to the study. They did not speak of personal things in the study. They spoke of the work, which was substantial and specific, and required concentration. She respected this boundary, without being told it was a boundary. She could see that the study was the place where he was most himself, where the containment eased slightly, because the work he was doing was the work he actually cared about, more than any of the formal responsibilities of the throne. She did not push at those edges. She brought everything she had found in the day's reading, organized and cross-referenced, and he took it without ceremony and used it, and she watched him work and learned from watching. She was also learning something else in those weeks, something she had not planned for. She was learning him. Not in the way that suggested warmth, not at first. She was learning him the way she learned everything, by observation and pattern recognition, and the careful assembly of small data points into something coherent. She learned that he drank his tea cold, without noticing it had gone cold. That he stood at the window when he was working through something difficult, not looking at anything, just giving himself the physical space of looking outward. That he remembered every number she gave him perfectly, and every name with perfect accuracy, but sometimes forgot that he had not eaten, and Clara had learned to simply leave food on the desk corner and say nothing. She learned that he was never late to any meeting or obligation, but that he arrived at precisely the right moment, and not before, which was the behavior of someone who measured punctuality not as social courtesy but as efficiency. She learned that he was never impatient with incompetence, only with dishonesty, and that the difference was clear on his face if you were watching for it. She also learned, gradually, that he was watching her with the same quality of attention she was giving him, not in an uncomfortable way, in the way of a careful person who has encountered something they haven't fully categorized yet, and is gathering information responsibly. On an evening 3 weeks into her time at the keep, she arrived at the study to find the door closed. She raised her hand to knock. Through the heavy door she could hear 2 voices, his and another, lower and more agitated. She waited without meaning to listen, but the other voice was not being careful about volume. The other voice said the ward arrangement was unusual, and that the council would ask about it at the next meeting. It said the king's attention to the girl was noted. It said there were questions about her bloodline, questions that had apparently spread despite the physician's silence, and that those questions were going to need to be answered in a way that satisfied the council's concerns before they became something louder. The voice belonged to a man, older, and the cadence suggested someone accustomed to being listened to. She recognized it from one of the council sessions she had been permitted to observe from the outer gallery. Lord Crane, one of the 3 high lords Calum had described to her on the road. Calum's voice through the door was level. He said the ward arrangement was within his legal authority, and that the council's questions about bloodlines were premature and would be addressed in the appropriate setting when he determined the appropriate setting had arrived. Lord Crane's voice said he was simply offering counsel, the way a senior lord was obligated to do. Calum's voice said the counsel was received. A silence. Then Crane left through a different exit, and she heard his footsteps fade down the corridor. She waited a moment, then knocked. Calum said to enter. He was standing at the window when she came in, his hand on the sill, his back to the door. He said, without turning around, "You heard that." "Some of it," she said. "Crane will not wait long before he moves from words to action," he said. "He doesn't tolerate uncertainty, and he's decided you are a form of uncertainty." "What form of action are we discussing?" she asked. The territorial council session fell on the 14th day of the 2nd month of Ilara's time at the keep, and Calum had told her 3 days before it that she would not be attending. Not because she lacked standing, he said, but because he was not yet ready to present her publicly, and presenting her halfway would cost more than waiting. She had accepted this, as she accepted most things, by assessing the reasoning and finding it sound. What she had not been told was that Lord Crane had arranged for a private meeting with 2 of the other High Lords to occur in the side chamber adjacent to the council room while the main session was underway, at a time when the keep's guard resources were concentrated in the main hall. She found out about it from Clara. Clara did not say it directly. She said it sideways, in the manner of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, but needed the listener to draw the conclusion independently. She mentioned, while reviewing supply deliveries that morning, that the larder access on the Eastern Service Corridor had been requested specifically by Lord Crane's personal aide for a late afternoon delivery, and that the request had bypassed the usual scheduling system, and that she thought it was odd, because the Eastern Service Corridor was not the usual delivery route, and also ran directly past the lower corridor that connected to Ilara's wing of the keep. Ilara looked at Clara for a moment. Clara looked at her supply ledger. Ilara thanked her for the information, and went to find Owen, who was the senior pack guard assigned to the keep during the council period, and who, unlike most of the guard staff, had a genuine interest in the security implications of irregular delivery routes. She told Owen what Clara had told her. She framed it as a logistical concern. Owen frowned and pulled out the guard schedule, and looked at it, and said he'd reroute the lower corridor coverage for the afternoon session. She thanked him. She spent the rest of the morning in the study, working alone. Calum was in pre-session meetings, and would be in the council hall through the afternoon. She had the study to herself, and she used it efficiently, finishing the cross-referencing work from the previous evening, and starting the next section of the chronological case they were building. At the second hour past midday, she heard footsteps in the lower corridor that did not match the pattern she had memorized. There were 3 of them. They were trying to be quiet, and they were reasonably good at it, but not good enough. Not for her. She set down her pen. She listened. The footsteps stopped outside the door of the study wing anteroom, which was 2 rooms away from the study itself. She stood up. She was not afraid. She noted this with some interest, because it was the kind of situation that produced fear in most people, and she had fully expected to feel it. Instead, what she felt was a tightening of focus, a clarity that was almost physical. The same feeling as looking through a lens and finding the focal point where everything previously blurred becomes precise. She crossed the study and went through the connecting door into the anteroom and opened the anteroom door into the corridor. 3 men. She recognized 2 of them from the council sessions. The third she did not know. They were not in council clothes. They were in plain working gear. None of them were carrying anything visible, but the shape of their movements told her they were armed under their coats. Lord Crane was not with them. Of course not. Lord Crane was a man who sent people. The 3 men looked at her. She looked back at them. The one in front, a wide-shouldered man with a red-brown beard, who she thought of as Broad, said that they were looking for the supply delivery access, and seemed to have taken a wrong turn. She said the supply access was on the opposite side of the building. Broad said that was helpful, and the 3 of them did not move. Ilara looked at them steadily. She thought about the next 60 seconds with the focused, sequential clarity that she was increasingly understanding was her version of what other people called instinct. She thought about what these 3 men intended, which was obvious, and what they would do about that intention, and what her options were, and which of those options were actually available to her. What she felt, in that moment, was the thing inside her arrive. Not slowly, the way it had been moving for weeks, that long, deep turn like a tide. This was immediate. This was the thing deciding that the circumstances had sufficiently changed to require a different pace. It came up through her like heat through stone, from the ground up, and it was silver, and it was enormous, and it was the most awake thing she had ever felt in her life, and she understood in that instant that every moment before this had been preparation. Broad took a step toward her. She raised her hands. She was not trying to do what happened next. She was not reaching for anything specific. She was simply responding to what the moment required, the way a musician responds to a key change. Not with thought, but with the body knowledge of long preparation, finally meeting its occasion. Silver light poured from her palms. Not violently. It did not explode or crack or make a sound. It spread, like light spreads when a shutter opens, filling the corridor in both directions from where she stood. It was the color of the sky one moment before dawn, when the darkness gives up, but the sun has not yet appeared. It was absolutely and completely silver. The 3 men stopped. Broad reached for whatever was under his coat. The silver light touched his hand first, and his arm went rigid. Not in pain, but in something else, in the absolute, total inability to continue. He was not hurt. He was held. His hand stayed where it was, halfway to his weapon, and did not move further. All 3 of them were like that. Suspended. Not harmed. Simply stopped. She stood between them with her hands raised, and silver light running from her wrists to her fingertips and pooling around her feet on the stone floor, and she looked at Broad and said, in a voice that was completely level, that she was going to suggest very strongly that they turn around and leave the keep's lower level through the eastern service entrance and tell Lord Crane that the delivery route was unavailable. Broad's eyes were wide. He was not a coward, she could see that. He had done difficult things before, and had the steadiness of someone who was accustomed to difficult things. But this was not a category of difficult thing he had prepared for. He looked at his arm. He looked at the silver light on the floor. He looked at her face. She looked back with the same expression she had used at the ceremony, on the day the pack had looked at her and found nothing, the expression of a person who has nothing to prove, and therefore nothing to be afraid of. Broad made a small sound. He pulled his arm back, carefully, as if testing whether the silver light would release him. It did. The three men looked at each other. Some unspoken agreement was reached. They walked back down the corridor in the direction they had come. She heard the eastern service door open and close. The silver light faded slowly, the way sunrise fades into ordinary morning, gradually becoming something you can't separate from the light around it. She lowered her hands. She looked at her palms. The veins were bright silver under the skin, brighter than she had ever seen them, and they were fading now, but fading slowly, like a fire that has found good fuel and is content. She stood in the empty corridor for a moment. She breathed. She felt the enormous thing inside her settle back, not into sleep, never back into sleep, but into a different kind of presence, alert, aware, ready without the urgency of crisis. She went back to the study. She picked up her pen. She continued working. When Calum returned from the council session 3 hours later, she was still at the desk. He came in and looked at her, and then looked more carefully, in the way he did when something had changed in a room since he left it. She told him what had happened. She told him simply and chronologically and without dramatizing it. She saw his jaw set at the part about Broad and the other two, and she saw his expression shift at the part about the silver light, and she watched him process the full account with the careful, controlled face of someone receiving important information and organizing it in real time. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Were you hurt?" "No," she said. "Were they?" "No." He nodded. He was quiet again. He moved to the window, the way he did when he was working through something. He stood there for a moment. Then he turned around and said, "Crane is not going to leave this alone. The account those three men bring back to him is going to accelerate his timeline." "I know," she said. "That changes the council presentation. I was planning 3 more months of preparation." He looked at her directly. "I don't have 3 months anymore." She held his gaze. "What do you have?" 2 weeks, he said. "Maybe 3. "Then we use them," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the calculating look. Something different. Something she did not have a precise name for. The look of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, and has just felt someone else put their hand under it. He said, quietly, "I need you to let me see it." She looked at him. "The silver light?" "What you did in the corridor," he said. "I need to understand it before I can present it. Not as evidence of a threat, as evidence of what the silver vein gift actually is." She put down her pen. She turned her hands palm up on the desk. She thought about the corridor, about the moment the thing inside her had arrived without being called. She did not reach for it now. She did not try to produce a performance. She simply let herself be present with it, the way she had learned to in the past weeks, openly, without urgency. The silver thread appeared. It ran from her wrists, across her palms, and into her fingers, fine and steady and completely still, like a river that has found its proper channel and has stopped looking for another one. He watched. He did not move. He did not look away. The silver light sat in her palms between them in the quiet study, and the lamplight on his face showed her the exact moment something in him let go of a weight he had been holding, because the lines around his eyes eased in a way she had not seen before, and he breathed out once, slowly, in the specific way a person breathes when they have been not quite breathing properly for a very long time. She let the light fade. She folded her hands. "That," she said, "is what your grandfather tried to destroy." He looked at her for a long moment. His voice, when it came, was quieter than usual. "I know," he said. They worked late that night, very late. When she finally rose to leave, he stood as well, and walked with her to the study door, and said goodnight in a way that was not very different from the other times but was somehow entirely different from all of them. She walked back through the quiet keep and let the silver warmth in her veins settle into something that felt, at last, like its own kind of coming home. The next morning she rose before first light and went to the eastern courtyard, which was an open stone square, enclosed by 3 walls of the keep and the 4th wall of the ridge itself. No one used it in the early hours. It was where the keep stored its practice dummies for the guards' training sessions, and where the stone fountain had not worked in years, and where the light arrived last because of the ridge. She stood in the center of the courtyard. She breathed. She let the thing inside her breathe with her. She had been learning it, slowly, the way you learn a language you already know, but have never spoken out loud. She understood from the old text that it was not a weapon in the ordinary sense. It was not something she could aim and fire and reload. It worked from the inside out, from truth outward, which meant the more honest and clear she was internally, the more powerfully it responded, and the more confused or afraid she was, the more it retreated. This morning she was neither. This morning she was simply herself, standing in the cold courtyard, with the ridge wall at her back, very clear and very awake. She raised her hands. She did not force anything. She held her palms open and waited. The silver came. It came differently than it had in the corridor, not the sudden arrival of crisis but something slower and more deliberate, a tide rather than a wave. It ran from her wrists to her fingertips, and then, when she did not resist it or try to shape it, it spread further, upward along her arms, and she could see it now through her skin, the way you can see light through closed fingers, silver and continuous, and moving with its own logic. She let it go outward. The practice dummy nearest to her bent slightly backward, as if leaned on by something very large and very gentle. The stone of the courtyard floor around her feet shimmered once with silver, and went back to gray. Her hair lifted slightly in the absence of any wind. She breathed in. The silver pulled back. She breathed out. It spread again. She did this for an hour, not trying to accomplish anything specific, only learning the range and the rhythm and the feel of it, learning where it was strong and where it thinned, learning that it responded to intention more than to effort, that the harder she pushed, the less it gave her, and the more honest she was about what she needed, the more it offered. By the time the courtyard began to receive the first pale light of morning, and the keep started to come alive with the sounds of early staff, she had learned several things. She had learned that the gift could be sustained without exhausting her if she let it breathe naturally. She had learned that it had a particular response to dishonesty, that if she thought about something untrue while holding it, it flickered and receded, which was interesting and would require more exploration. And she had learned that when she was calm and grounded and very precisely herself, it was not a power she wielded, it was a power she was. She lowered her hands, she shook them out, she felt very awake and very light and very hungry. She went to the kitchen and ate a large breakfast and talked to Clara about supply schedules, and then she went to the study and organized the morning's work into the most efficient possible sequence. And when Calum arrived at the 7th hour, she had already made enough progress that he looked at the desk and then at her and said, without inflection, that she had started early. She said she had been doing something else first. He did not ask what. He sat down. He looked at the documents she had prepared. He began reading. She watched him work for a moment. She thought about the man who had not slept in 3 days, and who had sat with her until the 4th hour of the morning last week, working, not because he was afraid to stop, but because the work was what he had, instead of the person he had lost. She thought about how loss made people reorganize themselves around the empty space, the way a river changes course when an obstacle is placed in it, not becoming less, but becoming different, finding a new channel. Word moved faster than Alara had calculated. She had estimated that the 3 men Crane had sent would take a day, perhaps 2, to report back fully, and for Crane to decide on his next move. She had been wrong by half. By the evening of the same day, she had turned them back with silver light in the lower corridor. She saw the signs. The senior guard assigned to the eastern wing had been replaced with unfamiliar faces, who wore Crane's household mark on their collar lining. 2 of the council observers she had been permitted to watch from the gallery were no longer present at the afternoon session. The kitchen staff were quieter than usual in a way that suggested they had heard something and were being careful about whether to react to it. She told Calum over the evening meal, which they had started taking in the study, because eating in the main hall had become a context with too many layers of observation in it. He listened without interrupting. He ate while he listened, which she had learned to read as a good sign, meaning he was processing, not alarmed. When she finished, he said, "Crane is moving the council vote forward." "What vote?" she said. "He has been building a motion for 2 weeks," he said. "I knew about it. I expected it to come at the next session, which is 3 weeks away. Apparently he has enough agreement from 2 of the other lords to call an emergency session." He paused. "Which he is legally entitled to do." She thought about the irony of the most legally thorough challenge to her existence being conducted through proper procedure. "What does the motion say?" "It calls for a formal inquiry into the ward arrangement," he said, "which is the polite version. What it actually calls for is a public examination of your bloodline and a ruling on whether a ward of uncertain origin can legally reside in the keep without council approval." "And can they?" He looked at her. "Technically, a ward arrangement for a person of unknown bloodline requires council endorsement if the ward is to be given access to restricted areas. You were not given that endorsement. Because you were not planning to ask for it yet." "Because I was not ready to present the full record," he said. "A partial presentation is worse than no presentation." She understood this completely. You could not show the council one thread of a tapestry and expect them to understand the whole design. What Crane was doing was forcing them to cut the thread before the design was finished. She said, "When is the emergency session?" 4 days, he said. She put down her fork. She looked at the documents spread across the desk between them. She looked at the territorial map with its iron pins. She thought about what they had finished and what they had not, and how much of the unfinished work was load-bearing and how much was supplementary. "Show me what we have," she said. He did. He laid out the completed sections of the case, organized and documented, and she went through them with him across the next 2 hours, not reading everything, but testing the structure, looking for the places where the argument would hold under pressure, and the places where it could be pulled apart. She found 4 weak points. 2 of them were supplementary, meaning they added depth but their absence would not break the case. 2 were significant. She told him which ones and why. He did not argue. He made notes. At the end of the 2 hours, she said, "We can make the significant ones solid in 3 days, if we work efficiently." "We have 4 days, he said. 3 days of work, she said, and 1 day to present it in a way that the council cannot misunderstand. Presentation is not separate from the argument. It is part of it." He looked at her. "You've presented to an audience before?" "No," she said, "but I have observed enough of human behavior to know that the most perfectly constructed argument fails if the person receiving it cannot see themselves in it. The council members are not going to accept a 200-year-old injustice purely on its merits. They will accept it because they have been shown something that makes not accepting it more costly than accepting it." He was quiet. He looked at the documents. "The Silver Vein elders saw something true about Aldrich I, she said. They saw his intentions. They told him what they saw. He killed them for it. That is the story you are presenting. But the council is not going to sit with the full moral weight of that, unless you make them feel it." She paused. "Not the gift, not the blood, the choice. The choice those people made to say we see you clearly, and we will not pretend otherwise, and what that cost them." He was very still. He was looking at her the way he looked at things he was deciding about, the full, focused weight of his attention, with no division between it and something else. "You want to be part of the presentation," he said. "I think I need to be," she said, "not as evidence, as the thing that closes it, the end of the thread. 200 years ago they tried to sever it. The council is going to see it unsevered." He was quiet for a long time. She did not rush him. She waited with the patience she had learned from the thing inside her, which was more patient than anything else she had ever encountered. "It is dangerous," he said. "If Crane uses the session as the venue for the motion, the council becomes the arbiter on the spot. There will be no friendly ground." "I know," she said. "You will be examined," he said. "Your bloodline, your origins, your residence here, all of it." "Good," she said. "Let them ask everything." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, You're not afraid. No, she said. Are you? A pause, very brief. Of the council? No. He looked at the desk. Of what happens if this goes wrong for you? Yes. She absorbed this. She held it for a moment. Then she said, It won't. He looked up. She looked at him steadily, not with false confidence, not with the performance of certainty, but with the genuine grounded assurance of someone who has examined the situation clearly and arrived at a real conclusion. All right, he said. He turned to the documents. Show me which sections you want to lead with. They worked through the night. The fire burned low, and Clara came once to rebuild it, and left again without comment. The lamp oil was changed twice. Elara drank more tea than she normally would, and ate the bread Clara had left on the desk corner, and kept her pen moving through the hours. Calum worked with a concentration that she had come to recognize as his version of full engagement, the one where the careful containment dropped away just enough that he became something more immediate, more present, more like the person underneath the construction. She found, in the third hour past midnight, the final piece she had been looking for. It was in a set of correspondence between Aldrich and his personal secretary, correspondence so mundane that it had never been flagged or sealed or moved into a restricted section. It had simply sat in the General Territorial Correspondence Archive, overlooked because it looked like nothing. A series of letters about administrative matters, supply chains, building projects, routine pack management. In the fourth letter, dated 2 weeks before the massacre, Aldrich had written to his secretary about a meeting with the Silver Vein elders, and in the course of describing the meeting he had said something so revealing that she read it 3 times to confirm she was not misreading. He had written that the silver-blooded had told him what they could see in him, and he had found it intolerable. That was the word he used. Intolerable. Not dangerous, not threatening. Intolerable. Not because they were powerful, because they were right. She set the letter down. She looked at the lamplight on the ceiling. She thought about a man who had ordered a bloodline destroyed, not because they could harm him, but because they could see him, and he could not bear to be seen. She turned to Calum and read him the section. She watched his face while she read. When she finished, the silence in the study was very particular. It was the silence of something settling into its final position. That is the center of it, he said quietly. Yes, she said. They looked at each other across the desk. Outside, the keep was completely dark, and the night was at its deepest point, the hour before even the earliest risers began to move. He said, In 4 days, you are going to have to stand in front of a room full of people who have been told you don't exist, and let them look at you. Yes, she said. And you are not afraid. I am something, she said honestly. It isn't fear. I don't have a name for it yet. He looked at her. The lamplight between them was steady and warm. He said, very quietly, When I was 23, and I had just been given the throne, and the sealed archives, and the full knowledge of what my grandfather had done, I stood in the restricted archive alone, and I was also something that I didn't have a name for. She waited. It was the feeling, he said, of knowing that the only way forward required doing something that could not be undone, and that the alternative was to pretend you had not seen what you had seen, which I knew I was not capable of. She looked at him. She said, What did you do? I started reading, he said, and I kept reading. She thought about herself at 14 in the pack reading room, turning books over and noting which ones were spine in, and working out how to reach the high shelves. She thought about herself at 22 in a laundry hall, finding a thin hand-stitched volume with no title on its spine. She thought about the particular quality of a person who responds to an enormous thing by beginning, methodically, to understand it. Yes, she said, that's what I would have done too. The lamp between them was very still. He said, without looking away, I think perhaps that is the least surprising thing either of us has discovered in the past month. She held his gaze. She felt the silver warmth run through her veins and settle. She said, Let's finish the 4th section before morning. He turned to the documents. She turned to hers. The night held them steady while they worked. 3 days passed with a ferocity that Elara had not anticipated. She had known it would be demanding. She had not known that demanding work, when it was the right work at the right time with the right person, had a quality that was almost the opposite of strain. She was tired at the end of each day, in a way that went deep into her bones, But it was the tiredness that follows something real, not the tiredness that comes from work that costs you without returning anything. They worked in the study through the days, and she spent the early mornings in the courtyard, practicing. She had stopped calling it practice, in her mind, because that implied she was preparing for something separate from what she already was. It was more accurate to say that she went to the courtyard each morning to learn herself in real time, to find the new range of the gift each day and map its edges. The gift was growing. She did not say this to Calum. She was not hiding it. It simply had not come up in the practical terms of what they were building for the council session. But she was aware of it with the quiet, steady awareness she brought to everything important. What had started as a thread was becoming a river. What had required effort to hold was becoming easy to carry. What had been triggered by crisis was beginning to respond to intention. On the third morning she was in the courtyard when Calum came out through the corridor door. He did not interrupt. He stood at the edge of the courtyard and watched. She was not hiding, so she did not behave as if she were. She let him see it. The silver was around both arms to the elbows and running faintly up her collarbones, and the air near her hands was slightly luminous. She held it steadily, turned it in a slow, deliberate arc across the practice dummies, let it settle, like the tide settling, and then breathed it back. She turned to face him. He was standing very still. She said, "It has been growing." "I can see that," he said. "I don't think it is going to stop," she said. "I think the awakening is a process. I think it is still happening." He looked at her for a moment. "Is that frightening?" She considered the question honestly. "No," she said. "It feels like finding out a word in a language you already speak. It's always been there. I'm only now learning what it is." He came out into the courtyard. He walked toward her slowly, not with any particular agenda, just crossing the space. He stopped a few feet from her. The morning was cold and gray, and the fog was still on the ridge behind the keep, but the courtyard was beginning to lighten. He looked at her hands, then he looked at her face. He said, "On the day I found the massacre order, I decided I was going to spend my reign undoing as much of my grandfather's damage as I could reach. I did not know at the time whether I would succeed. I still don't know, but I decided to start." He paused. "I have not told anyone that. I mention it because I realize I am about to walk into a council session and ask 24 territorial lords to accept a revision of 200 years of history, and I want you to know that regardless of what the council does, that decision was made 3 years ago, and it is not conditional." She looked at him. She understood what he was doing. He was telling her that what happened in the next 4 days did not change his commitment, that it was not dependent on the council's approval or the outcome of any vote, that it was already real. She said, "I know." "Good," he said. He turned and walked back toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "The main hall session starts at the 2nd hour. I would like you in the gallery." She said she would be there. He went back inside. She stood in the courtyard for a moment more, feeling the morning come in, and then she lowered her arms and went to prepare. The day before the emergency session, Crane made his final move. He sent a formal written demand to Calum's office, delivered through the council's official courier, requesting that Alara be placed in provisional council custody, pending the session's deliberations. It was legally framed with precision, and it cited 3 specific articles of territorial law. It was also, Alara understood when Calum showed it to her, a test. Crane was testing whether Calum would comply, which would signal weakness, or refuse outright, which would signal a willingness to break with the council's legal framework. Calum wrote a response in 20 minutes. He did not comply. He did not refuse. He responded with his own legal citation, specifically, the Ward Protection Statute that predated all 3 of Crane's cited articles, and noted that provisional council custody did not supersede an active royal ward arrangement without a council majority vote, which had not yet occurred. He also noted, in the final line, that he expected the session to proceed on schedule, and that he looked forward to presenting the full evidentiary record to the assembled lords. He sent it through the same courier without any visible change in his demeanor. Alara read the response when he showed it to her. She said, "That last line is a warning." "Yes," he said. "He'll know you have more than he expects." "He'll suspect it," Calum said. Knowing and suspecting are different. Suspicion makes careful people more careful, and reckless people more reckless. Crane is careful. He'll be more careful tomorrow, which means he will be more formal and more procedural, which is exactly the ground I want. The council hall was built for permanence. Everything about it communicated this. The stone columns, the height of the ceiling, the way sound moved in it with a slight delay, as if the room itself required a moment to consider whether words were worth carrying. The territorial lords sat in tiered semicircular seating that rose on three sides, and the speaking floor at the center was a circle of polished stone that had been walked by enough people over enough centuries that it was worn smooth in the middle. The king's position was at the far end, elevated slightly, not enough to suggest distance, but enough to anchor the room's hierarchy. Elara sat in the gallery above. The gallery was technically observation space, and technically open to ward residents of the keep, which she was, technically. She was aware that her presence in the gallery would be noted, and that it was intended to be noted. She was also aware that from the gallery she had a clear line of sight to every seat in the hall, including Lord Crane's, which was in the third tier on the left, and that Lord Crane had already clocked her position the moment she entered, and had not looked at her since, in the very deliberate way of a person who wants it known that they are choosing not to look. She settled into her seat and folded her hands in her lap and watched. The session opened with the standard formalities, which she had now observed enough times to follow without effort. Roll confirmation, precedence statements, the formal reading of the session's agenda. The emergency session agenda was short, one item. The inquiry motion concerning the ward of uncertain origin in residence at Drace Keep. Uncertain origin was the phrase Crane had chosen. She noted it. Calum opened. He stood at the speaking floor with the case files in a leather binder, and began with something that surprised even the room. He did not address the ward motion. He said he wished to submit a formal evidentiary record for council consideration before the motion's business began, and that the record was directly relevant to the motion's substance, and that he requested 10 minutes to present an overview. Crane objected immediately. The procedure for emergency sessions did not include evidentiary submissions before the motion's discussion, he said. Calum cited the article that covered newly surfaced territorial evidence and its right to council presentation at any session. Crane cited a counter-article. Calum cited a third article that superseded it. The legal exchange was brief and precise, and at the end of it, three of the other lords, who had clearly not been briefed by Crane on this specific procedural point, voted to allow the 10 minutes. The room shifted. Crane's jaw set. Calum opened the binder. Elara watched him present. She watched the way he moved on the speaking floor, not pacing, not gesturing more than the material required, moving only when the movement carried meaning. She watched the lords in the tiered seats as he spoke, watching for the ones who began attending more closely, and the ones who looked to Crane before they allowed themselves to react. He laid the framework first. Territorial history from the founding of the current dynasty, the Silver Vein community, their role, the nature of their gift. He did this in 2 minutes without dwelling. Then he moved to Aldrich I and the reasons for the massacre, as documented in the original order, which he produced as a physical document passed to the council clerk for verification. Several lords leaned forward at the sight of the wax seal. He then presented what he called the discrepancy record, the official history as it had been taught versus the documented account he had assembled from primary sources. He moved through it with the same controlled efficiency he brought to everything. He did not editorialize. He did not draw moral conclusions for the room. He presented the evidence and let the evidence speak, which was what he had understood from the beginning, and what she had helped him shape. That a room of powerful people responded to facts presented without manipulation, because manipulation was what they were trained to detect and resist. At the 8-minute mark he produced the letter with the word intolerable. He read it aloud. He read it once. He did not comment on it. The hall was very quiet. He said, "The original massacre order declared the Silver Vein community a territorial threat. The record shows they were not a territorial threat. They were removed because they refused to offer loyalty to a man whose intentions they had clearly identified. They were destroyed because they were honest, and because the king they were honest with could not tolerate being seen." He paused. The 10 minutes were up. He closed the binder. "The ward in the gallery," he said, "is the last living member of the Silver Vein bloodline." Every head in the hall turned upward. Elara sat with her hands folded and looked back at the room. Crane was already on his feet. He said the council had not agreed to hear witness testimony and that the presentation had exceeded its agreed scope, and that the emergency session must return to its scheduled purpose. 3 lords spoke simultaneously, which never happened. The session moderator called for order. Order was restored with difficulty. Calum said that he had not presented a witness. He had provided context for evidence he was legally entitled to submit. He said the council could choose how to proceed from here, which was their right and their authority. He sat down. The session broke into procedural chaos for 20 minutes. Alara sat in the gallery and watched. She watched Crane move through the tiers speaking privately to lords, watched 3 of them nod and 2 of them not nod, watched the shape of the room's opinion forming the way weather forms, gradually, and then all at once. The moderator called order again. She said the council would hear from the ward in the gallery, which was within the session's purview as the subject of the motion, and that formal testimony procedures would apply. Alara rose. She walked from the gallery through the connecting corridor and down the stairs to the council hall entrance. She walked onto the speaking floor. She stood in the center of the worn stone circle. She looked at the room. Lord Crane began the questioning before the moderator had finished the formality of opening testimony. He asked her name, her origin pack, her ranking, her bloodline documentation. She answered every question clearly and completely. He asked whether she had produced a supernatural phenomenon in the lower corridor of Drace Keep on the 14th of the prior month. She said yes. He asked her to describe it. She described it. She was precise. She did not minimize or amplify. He asked whether she could produce this phenomenon at will. She said she could. He asked her to demonstrate. The room went still. She looked at Crane. She looked at the lords in their tiered seats. She looked at Calum, sitting at the king's position at the far end of the floor, and he looked back at her, and she thought about all the work they had done, and all the evidence they had built, and everything that they had both been carrying for a long time, before they found each other carrying it. She turned her palms upward. The silver came. It was not the corridor burst of crisis or the quiet thread of morning practice. It was something between those two things. The river, at full but unhurried, running from her wrists to her fingertips and up her forearms, and casting its light onto the stone floor around her feet and into the air above her hands. It was entirely still. It was entirely certain. It was the color of something that had waited for a very long time and had finally been allowed to simply be. The hall was silent. She held it for 20 seconds, then she breathed it back. Crane was on his feet again. He said this was evidence of a volatile and uncontrolled ability that posed a security risk to the council and the keep. She said, calmly, that what she had demonstrated was neither volatile nor uncontrolled, and that if it had been volatile she would not have chosen to demonstrate it in a room full of people she had no intention of harming. Crane said that unregistered and unclassified abilities required containment under territorial security law. She said that the Silver Vein gift was registered in the territorial record as it existed prior to the massacre, which was part of the evidentiary record just submitted, and that the reason it had been unregistered since was that the people responsible for maintaining the record had also ordered the elimination of every person who carried the gift. A silence in the hall, the kind of silence that happens when a room of careful people arrives at the same thought simultaneously. Crane said that was an unsubstantiated claim. She said it was in the evidence binder that the council clerk currently held for verification. Another lord, not one of Crane's 3, asked a question. His name was Lord Ashton, and he was from the Eastern Territory, and he had the manner of a person who had spent a long time watching and waiting for a reason to speak. He asked her what the Silver Vein gift was, precisely, in its practical operation. He said not what it looked like but what it did. She looked at him. She thought about the old book. She thought about the truth force, the sovereignty of perception. She thought about standing in the corridor with 3 men who had come to remove her, and feeling the gift arrive like a tide. She said it was clarity. It was the ability to see what was true beneath what was presented. It was not a weapon, and it did not respond well to anger or dishonesty, her own or others. It worked from truth outward. You could not use it to deceive. You could not use it to manipulate. You could only use it to hold people still long enough to see what they were actually doing, or to let the truth be visible to anyone who was willing to look. Lord Ashton said, "And you cannot be dominated by pack command?" "No," she said. "Or overridden by a superior rank?" "No." Because the gift does not recognize hierarchy in the conventional sense. Because the gift recognizes truth, she said, and truth is not arranged by rank. The silence afterward was different from the ones before. This one had weight. It had the weight of something that had just landed somewhere after falling for a long time. Crane made 3 more procedural attempts to redirect the session. Each was countered, twice by Calum and once by Lord Ashton, who had apparently decided to stop being quiet. A 4th lord, one who had been one of Crane's original 3, asked to see the letter with the word intolerable. The clerk passed it to him. He read it. He set it down carefully on the tier in front of him. Crane called for the motion. He had enough procedural standing to force it. The vote was called. Elara stood on the speaking floor with her hands at her sides and waited. The motion, as originally written, called for provisional council custody pending inquiry. To pass, it required a simple majority. It failed by 1 vote. Crane's face did not change, but his hands, she saw, had gone flat on the tier in front of him, the way hands go flat when they are being held still. The session moderator moved to close. Calum stood. He said that in light of the evidentiary record presented today, he wished to announce a formal record correction process under territorial law to revise the documented history of the Silver Vein community and its members. This would proceed through the proper channels over the following months and would be open to council review at each stage. No one objected. He said one more thing. He said the ward arrangement for Elara Voss would continue under the existing royal authority, and that he would be requesting council endorsement at the next scheduled session, where the evidentiary record would be available in full to any lord who wished to review it in advance. He sat down. The session closed. She stood on the speaking floor as the lords filed out of the tiered seats and spoke to one another in the voices of people who have just witnessed something they will be talking about for the rest of their lives. She stood very still and breathed. She felt the silver in her veins like a steady current, unhurried, at home. She thought about the ceremony, the cold stone under bare feet, the elder's face, her father looking slightly to the left. She thought about the way the territorial lords had gone quiet when the silver filled her palms. She thought, different people, same truth, some things you cannot refuse to see once you have seen them. She walked off the speaking floor. She walked through the connecting corridor. She was in the hallway when she heard footsteps behind her. One set, quick but not hurried. She stopped. She turned. Calum was walking toward her with the case binder under one arm, and the same contained expression he always wore, but the lines around his eyes were different than they had been that morning. They were easier, less held. He stopped a few feet from her. He said, that last answer, the one about truth not being arranged by rank. She waited. I am going to need you to say that again, he said, at the formal record correction hearing, in those exact words. She looked at him. She felt the silver warm in her veins, and the thing inside her at full and quiet and unhurried. All right, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, quietly, as if it was not a significant thing, though they both understood it was, thank you. She nodded. She turned and walked down the corridor. She heard his footsteps fall in beside hers. They walked back through the keep together. The council hall behind them was still full of voices. Ahead of them was a study full of documents, and a map with iron pins, and 2 empty shelves in her room that she had not yet filled. She thought she was going to be here long enough to fill them. The weeks after the council session were different in quality from the ones before. The before weeks had the density of preparation, the particular thickness of time when everything is building towards something. The after weeks were not quiet, not empty, but they breathed differently. The shape of the work changed. Crane made no further moves. She had expected him to. Calum had also expected it. But Lord Ashton's involvement had apparently shifted the internal council mathematics in a way that left Crane without the numbers he needed for any further formal action, and Crane was, as Calum had said, a careful man. He would not move without the numbers. She began working openly in the study, rather than by invitation. There was no formal arrangement. It simply became the pattern. She was there most afternoons, and most evenings, and Calum was there when he wasn't in meetings or hearings, and they worked alongside each other with the comfortable efficiency of people who have learned one another's rhythms. She knew he thought better when he could pace. He knew she thought better with complete silence, which he maintained without being asked. She knew he had forgotten to eat if Clara hadn't been by. He knew she needed the lamp on her left side, not the center of the desk, or she got headaches. The bookshelves in her room were slowly filling. Calum had opened the full restricted archive to her access, formally documented, which meant she could work directly from primary sources without the wire in 4 minutes method. She spent 3 mornings per week there and brought findings to the study in the afternoons. The record correction case was becoming more complete with every week. Each section solid and specific and cross-referenced in ways that would survive any scrutiny. Lord Ashton came to the keep for a private meeting with Calum in the 3rd week. Afterward, Calum told her that Ashton had requested a conversation with her on the record, as part of his independent review. She met with him for 2 hours in a formal room, with a council observer present. He asked good questions about the gift, the bloodline, the history. At the end, he asked what she wanted. The gift did not stop growing. Alara had understood theoretically that the awakening was a process rather than an event. She had believed it because the evidence supported it. Now she understood it in the way that you understand something you have moved through with your whole body, rather than only your mind. It began with the sensitivity. She had always had sharp hearing, always been good at catching what was said at the edges of a room, always noticed the things people tried not to show on their faces. The silver in her blood intensified this. It did not give her anything new. It made everything she already had more precise, the way a lens makes the image more precise, rather than creating the image from nothing. She could hear a conversation in the corridor from 2 rooms away now. She could feel the particular quality of a person's tension from across a table, without needing to see their hands or their face. She could tell, in a way she could not yet fully articulate, when something being said to her was true, and when it was something other than truth. This last quality was the most significant, and the most complex. She discovered it by accident, in a routine meeting with a keep administrator about supply requisitions. He was presenting the quarterly numbers, and about halfway through the presentation, she felt something that she could only describe later as a kind of brightness dimming, the way a clear sky shifts when a cloud moves over it. She looked at the administrator, and he was doing nothing visible. His expression was the same. His posture was the same. But the quality of the air between them had changed. She let him finish. She thanked him. After he left, she went through the numbers herself and found the discrepancy. Minor. A rounding error that had been consistently applied in the same direction across 12 months. Not necessarily intentional, but the first time she had felt it in real time. She told Calum that evening. He looked at her with the expression that meant he was updating something. He said he would have someone review the administrator's past 3 years of submissions. She said it was possible it was an honest error, and that she did not want someone investigated unfairly on the basis of her intuition. He said he would have the records reviewed independently and draw no conclusions until there was something to conclude from. She said that was fair. The review found a pattern. 13 months of consistent minor errors in the same direction. The administrator's explanation, when asked, was that he had been using a calculation method he had assumed was correct. He demonstrated the method. The method was incorrect in the specific way that produced the errors. He had been using it for 3 years without anyone catching it. It was almost certainly an honest mistake. Almost. She held this in mind. She held the fact that the gift was not infallible, that it did not read intent, only something in the quality of the transaction between truth and the person presenting it, and that quality could be disturbed by many things that were not dishonesty. Confusion, stress, incomplete information, a person who was themselves uncertain about what they were saying. She began to calibrate it. She was also, in those weeks, beginning to work with it deliberately in a different way, not defensively, not in crisis, but as an active component of the work she was doing. The record correction case was in its formal stage, and she was preparing the presentation section, the part that she would deliver at the hearing. She sat in the courtyard each morning and let the silver breathe and thought about what she wanted the council to feel when she spoke. Not manipulated, not convinced against their will, but seen. She wanted the room to feel, for however long the testimony lasted, what it was like to be told that what you could see clearly was not real, and to stand in that conviction regardless. She worked on it the way she worked on everything, carefully, with patience, without hurrying the parts that needed time. Calum watched her practice once, from the doorway of the study looking out into the courtyard. She was not speaking aloud. She was simply sitting with her hands open, the silver steady in her palms, and her face had an expression he later described to himself, privately, as the one she made when she was being completely honest. It was not a soft expression. It was not a performance. It was a person, not hiding anything. He stood there for longer than he meant to. He had been noticing that he did this. Stayed in doorways, paused mid-motion, found reasons to remain in the room she was in for slightly longer than was professionally necessary. He had been noticing it and making a note of it and then continuing with his work because he was practical, and the work was pressing, and there was a formal hearing in 3 weeks and approximately 20 other things that required his immediate attention. But he was also honest with himself. It was one of the things he had insisted on, privately, after Veda, that he would not lie to himself about what he felt because he had done enough damage by allowing himself to be imprecise about important things. He felt something about Ilara that was specific and serious, and had been specific and serious for some time. He had not named it to her. He did not know if he would. He knew he was not ready to be careless about it. What he was ready for, he decided on a morning 3 weeks before the hearing, was to be less contained. He was not good at this. He was aware of not being good at it. He had built containment so carefully over so many years that it had become structural, load-bearing, a thing that kept other things standing. Taking any of it apart required care. He began with small things. He began by asking her, at the end of a working evening, whether she had eaten, which he had noticed she sometimes forgot as thoroughly as he did. She said she had not, and he said neither had he, and they went to the kitchen together, which was empty at that hour, and found the leftovers from dinner, and ate them cold over the kitchen table while discussing the week's agenda, and neither of them remarked on the fact that eating cold leftovers in the Keep kitchen at the 11th hour was not what either of them would have predicted for themselves a year ago. He began by telling her things that were not necessary for the work. He told her once about the eastern forest, that there was a ridge point 2 hours walk into it, where the trees opened, and you could see 3 of the 5 territories on a clear day. She asked if they could go. He said after the hearing. She said all right. He began by staying in the room an extra minute. Not much, just a minute, but the minutes accumulated into something. She noticed. She noticed everything. But she did not name it either, because she was also patient, and she had also decided to let things become what they were in their own time, rather than reaching for them before they were ready. What they were building, she understood, was not something that would arrive in one moment. It was something that was arriving continuously, the way a river arrives at the sea, by every drop traveling the full length of the distance. 3 days before the hearing, something happened that was not planned, and was not gradual. She was in the study alone, working on the final section of the testimony, when a dispatch rider arrived at the Keep with a sealed message that Clara brought to her because Calum was in a session meeting and the dispatch was marked urgent. Clara set it on the desk and left. Ilara looked at the seal. She recognized the mark. It was from the Ashvale pack. She opened it. It was from Elder Dorn. He wrote formally and briefly. He wrote that he had been reviewing the evidentiary materials submitted through the official record correction process, and that certain elements had prompted him to revisit his own records from the year of her awakening ceremony. He wrote that he had found something he believed should be part of the formal record. He enclosed a single sheet of paper. She looked at the enclosure. It was the original record of her awakening ceremony, the official pack document that Elder Dorn had filed the night it occurred. She had never seen it. Why would she have? It was a pack record, not hers to access. She read it. The ceremony record contained the standard fields: name, date, outcome. Her name, the date, and then the outcome field, where Dorn had written, in his precise formal hand, "No wolf manifested." The candidate showed no standard indicators of successful awakening. However, the elder notes for record that at the completion of the ceremony, a visible pulse of silver-toned luminescence occurred beneath the candidate's left forearm for a period of approximately 2 seconds before resolving. This has been noted in the record as a possible anomalous indicator requiring follow-up evaluation. Follow-up evaluation was not conducted. She read it twice. He had seen it. He had written it down. He had noted it in the official record, and then said it needed follow-up, and not followed it up, and filed the record, and told her she was hollow. She sat with this for a long moment. She felt many things, none of which were anger, exactly. More like the particular weight of understanding that the shape of your life could have been entirely different, and that it hadn't been because of a combination of things you couldn't entirely account for. Some accident, some intention, some version of Elder Dorn sitting at his desk after the ceremony and deciding that the follow-up was something he did not know how to do, and so not doing it. She felt the silver in her veins move in the slow, deliberate way it moved when she was being very honest. She thought, he did write it down. He did see it. He did not discard it or pretend it hadn't happened. He saw it, wrote it down, and sat with his own uncertainty about it for 6 weeks and then, apparently, for 6 more years. And now he was sending it to be part of the record. She placed the enclosure carefully on the top of the testimony documents. She wrote a note on it marking it for inclusion. She kept working. When Calum came to the study that evening, she showed it to him. He read it. His jaw went through the motion she knew now as his processing something significant reaction. He read it again. He said, he's going to testify to it. He offered to, she said. The letter includes a formal offer to appear at the hearing as a witness. Calum set the letter down. He looked at her. She looked back. He said, is that something you want? She thought about it. She thought about Elder Dorn with his 42 awakenings, and his practiced voice, delivering hard news, and his decision not to follow up on an anomalous indicator. She thought about what it meant, that he had written it down anyway. She said, yes, I want it on the record. Calum nodded. He sent the acceptance through the official channels that evening. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark and thought about being seen. She thought about how many different shapes it took. The silver light visible for 2 seconds on her arm in a firelit ceremony, and a careful man writing it down, even when he didn't know what to do with it. The blood glowing in a vial under a silver light lens, and a physician going rigid with shock. A document produced on a speaking floor, and a room of territorial lords going quiet. All of it, the same thing. Something that had been there all along, asking to be acknowledged. She was almost ready. The hearing was 3 days away. The testimony was prepared. The evidence was organized. Dorn was coming. Ashton was favorable. The record correction process was formally approved and proceeding. And in the evenings, she sat across from Calum in the study, and they worked on the final details. And sometimes, between one section and the next, one of them would say something that was not about the work at all, something small, something honest, and the other would answer with the same quality of honesty, and neither of them reached for anything more than was there yet. But it was getting closer. She felt it the same way she felt everything she had learned to trust, not with drama, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of something that was real and was not going away. 3 days. Then the hearing. Then what came after. She had stopped thinking of the future as something to be cautious about. She had started thinking of it as something she was building. She closed her eyes. The silver settled in her veins like a river finding its bed. She slept. The morning before the hearing, she did not practice in the courtyard. She sat at her desk instead, reading through the testimony one final time, not looking for changes but confirming what was already there. The window was open. The eastern forest was green and deep with the late summer, and a wind came off the ridge that was just cool enough to remind her that the year was beginning to turn. She was reading the section on the community's refusal to submit when a knock came at her door. She said to come in. Calum opened the door and stood in the frame. He said, "The Ashvale elder arrived this morning." She looked up. Early. "He wanted to review the documents in advance," Calum said. "He asked to meet with you." She set down the testimony. She went down to the formal meeting room where Dorn was waiting, and she saw for the first time what years had done to him. He was older than she remembered from the ceremony. Thinner. He stood when she entered, and he looked at her with the steady, measuring quality she remembered, and beneath it, something that was not shame, exactly, but was an awareness of something that had not been done, and could not now be undone. He said her name. He said, "I am glad you are well." She said, "I am." He asked if he could sit. She said yes. He sat, and she sat across from him, and he put a folder on the table between them, and opened it, and she saw the original ceremony record, the one he had sent, and underneath it, 4 other documents she did not recognize. He said, "In the months after your ceremony, I returned to the record. Several times, I looked for records of similar anomalies in the old documentation, and I found 3 cases, all pre-massacre, none of them in any archive available to me at the time. I did not know where to look. I did not understand what I had seen." He paused. I continued the follow-up internally, which I should have shared with you or your father. I have no explanation for why I didn't. That satisfies me." She looked at him. She thought about him sitting in the Ashvale reading room looking for records he didn't know how to find, while she sat in the same reading room 6 years later and found them because she had been desperate enough to pull the spine-turned books off the back shelves. Two people circling the same truth from different distances. She said, "What did you find?" He passed the 4 documents across. They were copies, carefully made, of records he had found in 3 different PAC archives during visits over the subsequent years. Each one described an anomalous awakening candidate, pre-massacre. Each one used language that came close to but never quite named what she now understood it was. "I didn't know what they meant," he said. "Not until the evidentiary record was submitted and I read the full account." She looked at the documents. She thought about him carrying this, quietly, without knowing what to do with it. She thought about the particular weight of having seen something true and not having the frame to hold it. She said, "These belong in the formal record." The grand convergence of the 5 territories was held once every 10 years, and it happened to fall in the season of the record correction hearings, which were 2 months complete and progressing steadily through the council's approval stages. The convergence was a different kind of event from a council session. It was not procedural, it was ceremonial, which meant it was older and heavier, and carried a different kind of weight, the weight of tradition and symbolic power, and what people believed about themselves and their history when they came together to reaffirm it. Ilara had not attended the previous convergence because she had been 12 years old and living in Ashvale, which had sent its alpha and elder, and said nothing else about it. She had read the account in the PAC records afterward, and found it uninteresting in the way of things that are designed to be witnessed, rather than understood. This convergence, she had been reading about for 2 months with a different kind of attention. It was held at the Convergence grounds, which were a day's ride from Drace Keep on the Central Plateau, a flat expanse of stone and packed earth that had been the meeting ground since before any of the current territories had their present names. Representatives came from every PAC in the 5 territories, not just alphas and elders, but rank members, warriors, ordinary families who made the journey every decade to be present when their king reaffirmed his rule. There were banners, there were fires, there were old songs that nobody remembered the full words to, but everybody hummed the melody of. It was the kind of event that existed to make people feel part of something larger than their daily lives. Calum had told her, 3 weeks before the convergence, that he intended to do something at it that had never been done before. He had been building to it for months. Not secretly, not from her, but carefully, in the way he built everything, with thoroughness and attention to the load-bearing elements. He had spoken with Ashton. He had spoken with 2 other lords who had moved into the supportive column, as the record correction evidence mounted. He had drafted the language 7 times. She had reviewed 3 of the drafts and offered specific suggestions on 2 of them. He had told her what he planned. She had looked at him across the study desk when he finished and said, "Are you certain?" He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Then let's make sure it holds." They had spent the next week making sure it held. She rode to the convergence grounds with Calum's procession, which was not the small quiet group that had left Ashvale 9 months ago but the full formal company, black horses and ranked guard, and the king's standard, because this was the kind of occasion the full formal company was for. She rode near the back of the procession as was appropriate, and she watched the landscape change from the forest country around the keep to the open plateau, and she felt the silver in her veins, doing what it had been doing for months, running steady and clear and at ease. The grounds were already full when they arrived. The population of the 5 territories was not enormous by any standard, but it was dense in its gathering. PAC members from the farthest north to the coastal settlements in the west, and the banners of every major and minor PAC were arranged in their traditional positions around the central ceremonial dais. She had memorized the arrangement from the territorial records. She knew where Ashvale's banner was, though she had no intention of going near it. She found a position in the outer ring, near the eastern edge of the gathering, at the place where the representative crowd thinned, and observers had room to stand without being pressed on all sides. It was a position with a clear sight line to the central dais, and enough space to move if she needed to. She had been choosing positions like this for a year. She was comfortable in them. The ceremony opened with the formal processional, which was long. She watched. The 5 territorial lords took their positions on the upper tier of the dais. Pack alphas lined the 2 approach paths. The common representatives filled the ground around the dais in concentric rings. Calum walked to the dais alone, as the ceremony required. He had been doing this alone for 3 years, she thought. And before that, his predecessor had done it alone. And before that, his grandfather had done it alone. Always alone. Always elevated. Always the one person in the gathering who stood apart from the rest of it. He reached the dais. He stood at its center. The ceremony opened with the first address, which was traditional, and she tuned it out because she knew the words. She was watching the crowd around the dais. She was watching the faces of the people in the rings, pack members who had come from the farthest corners of the territories, who were here because this was the 10-year ceremony, and the 10-year ceremony was what you came to if you wanted to feel real in the world you lived in. She thought about what Calum had told her he was going to do. He had told her that he was going to do it before the renewal pledge, before the assembled lords spoke their formal submissions, and the pack alphas followed, and the ceremony moved into the section that made it all binding for another decade. He was going to interrupt the ceremony sequence, which was something that had never been done in recorded history, and do something instead. She thought about the word he had used when he described it. He had said, recognition. The first address ended. The space before the renewal pledge opened. The gathered crowd settled into the particular silence that comes before a formal ceremony moves through its most significant section. Calum looked out over the crowd. Then he stepped down from the dais. The silence became a different kind of silence. It became the kind of silence that happens when several thousand people collectively understand that something outside the expected frame has just occurred. She felt it move through the crowd like a wave passing through still water. Not loud, but physical. He walked. He walked off the dais and down the approach path and through the first ring of representatives, who parted before him not because they were told to, but because the instinct to create space for something moving with that quality of intent was too strong to resist. He walked through the second ring and the third. He kept walking. She saw where he was going before he got there. She was standing at the outer edge of the eastern ring, in the space where the crowd thinned, as she always was, watching. He was walking toward her with a pace that was not hurried and not slow, the pace of a man who has decided on something completely and is completing it. He reached her. He stopped in front of her. Thousands of people were watching. Nobody in the rings could see her clearly from their distance, but the people closest to her in the eastern ring certainly could, and they were very still. From the dais, the 5 lords and every alpha and every senior rank member had a direct line of sight to whatever was happening. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, in a voice that was not loud but was completely steady, "I need you to come with me." She said, "Where?" "The center," he said. She looked at him for a moment. She felt the silver running in her veins, warm and certain. She felt the thing inside her, enormous and awake and utterly at home. She said, "All right." They walked back through the rings together. The crowd parted again. She could feel the attention of the gathering, the way you feel pressure in the air, comprehensive and complete. Every face turned toward them. She walked beside him, without looking at the faces, looking only at the path ahead. They reached the dais. He stepped onto it. She stopped at its edge. He turned back to her and offered his hand. She took it. She stepped up. They stood together at the center of the dais, and the full gathered assembly of the 5 territories looked at them. Calum released her hand. He turned to face the crowd. He did not raise his voice, but the quality of the silence was such that it was not necessary. The convergence grounds were designed to carry sound. He said that before the renewal pledge, he had an announcement to make. He said that the 5 territories were in the process of formally correcting the territorial record, as the assembled lords were aware, and as the pack alphas had been notified through official channels. He said that the record correction concerned the Silver Vein bloodline and its history in these territories, a history that had been incorrectly documented for 2 centuries. He said that the woman standing beside him was the last living member of that bloodline, and that her name was Ilara Voss, and that she had been living in exile within these territories, unrecognized and unacknowledged, for the entirety of her life. He paused. He looked at the crowd. He said, "What was done to her people was wrong. It was wrong when it was done, and it was wrong in all the years of silence after it, and the record will now say so, in full, permanently and irrevocably." He said that what the Silver Vein Line had given the territories was not a threat, despite what the false record claimed, but a gift that the territories had been without for 200 years. The ability to see what was true beneath what was presented. The refusal to pretend otherwise when something could not be pretended. He said that in his judgment, after 3 years of building the evidence for this moment, those were not qualities the territories could afford to have, absent from their governance for another generation. Another pause. He turned. He looked at Alara. She looked back at him. The dais was very still. He went to one knee. The sound that moved through the crowd was not a gasp. It was something quieter and more complex than a gasp. It was the sound of several thousand people having the same understanding arrive at the same moment. He looked up at her from the knee he had never bent to anything in his life, not to ceremony, not to tradition, not to the grief he carried, or the pressure of the throne, or the weight of everything he had inherited. He looked at her with the full, direct, unhidden quality of his attention, and there was nothing contained about it now, nothing measured, nothing behind a wall. He said, "The Silver Vein Line refused to bow to my grandfather, because they saw him clearly, and what they saw was not worthy of the bow." That was not defiance. That was the most important kind of honesty. I am not my grandfather. I have spent 3 years trying not to be, and I am asking you, in front of everyone in these 5 territories, to stand beside this throne, not beneath it, beside it. The grounds were completely silent. Alara looked at him. She let herself look, properly, without managing what was on her face. She felt the silver in her veins, running from the ground up and from her center outward, the same silver that had breathed quietly inside her for 22 years, while everyone looked through her. The same silver that had pulsed on her arm for 2 seconds at a ceremony and been seen by an old man who had written it down and not known what to do with it for 6 years. The same silver that had filled a physician's vial and frozen 3 men in a corridor and shown a room full of territorial lords what 200 years of absence looked like when it finally came back. She reached out her hand. He took it. She pulled him to his feet. And in the moment he rose, the silver spread. Not from a deliberate reaching, not from intent or strategy, but from the simple fact of being here, fully, without hiding any part of what she was. It ran from her hand to the dais and outward in every direction, silver light on the stone, and in the air, and briefly, faintly, through the ground beneath the feet of the gathered crowd. Not threatening, not demanding, simply present. The way truth is present when it stops being held back, everywhere at once, quiet, completely certain of itself. The crowd went silent in a new way. And then, one by one, beginning with the people in the front ring and moving outward, pack by pack member by pack member, the bowed heads began. Not to the king. She could tell this. She could feel it, the way she could feel everything now, with the precise clarity of the gift. Not to him. To the silver. To the bloodline they had never been told was real. To the thing that had waited 200 years to be seen. She stood at the center of the dais and held Calem's hand and let them see her. All of her. The girl from the service quarter, the woman from the ceremony circle, the last member of a line that had refused to pretend and had been destroyed for it, and had come back anyway. She was not hollow. She had never been hollow. The thing inside her was not a wolf, had never been a wolf, was something older and deeper and more permanent than any shift or any change, something that could not be dominated or overridden or buried in a service quarter or registered as nothing on an awakening form. It was truth, it was hers, and it was not going anywhere. She looked at Calem, he looked at her. The crowd around them was an ocean of bowed heads, and she felt the silver returning to itself, settling back, not gone but home. She said, very quietly, only for him, after this. He said, after this. She turned back to the crowd. She stood straight. She let the keeping small impulse, the one she had been practicing her whole life, the one that had kept her safe and invisible and alive, she let it go. She straightened every part of herself she had ever held back. She stood at the exact full height of what she was. The silver was in her veins, and in the air, and in the stone of the dais, and in the carried memory of every pack that had ever told a story about a bloodline that could see what was true and had refused to lie about it. She stood with the man who had come to find her, and the crowd that had finally looked at her, and the history that was being corrected in real time, and she breathed. She was done waiting. The sun was overhead. The 5 territories were spread outward in every direction. Somewhere in the eastern forest, 2 hours' walk from a keep that now had a second desk in its study, a ridge waited, with a view of 3 territories on a clear day. After this, she would see it. For the first time, for all the times, there was no after that she could not reach. The renewal pledge followed. The lords gave it in turn, then the alphas, then the senior representatives of each pack, their voices rising together into the gray-blue sky. Alara stood at the edge of the dais and listened. She had not been asked to pledge. She was not sure yet what pledging meant for someone whose bloodline existed outside the traditional structure. That was something to be figured out, carefully and properly, in the months ahead. For now, she stood and listened to the voices of the 5 territories speaking the old words together, and she felt the silver very quietly in her veins, and she thought about what came next. What came next was practical and enormous in equal measure. The record correction hearings had 2 more stages, and the formal law revision process had not yet begun. The ward arrangement was scheduled for council review. The territorial register needed a new category that did not yet exist. There were packs in the outer territories that had not yet received the full evidentiary record, and would need it explained by someone patient enough to do that work properly. She was looking forward to all of it. She was also looking forward to a 2-hour walk and a ridge with a view.